Welcome, brave soul, to a realm where shadows breathe and nightmares take wing. Tonight, we journey through the darker corners of magical creature lore, where beauty masks danger and wonder walks hand in hand with terror. As you settle into your sanctuary of blankets and pillows, let these tales of magnificent beasts carry you into dreams both thrilling and chilling. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of creatures that haunt the magical world, beings whose very existence reminds us that not all magic is kind and not all wonders are safe. Rest now, as darkness reveals its most beautiful terrors. There exists no creature more beautiful in its destruction, more terrifying in its rebirth, than the phoenix. Born from flame, sustained by sorrow, and renewed through its own magnificent death, this sacred bird embodies the darkest truth of magic itself, that creation and annihilation are merely two faces of the same eternal coin. Tonight, as shadows lengthen and comfort settles around you like protective wings, let us explore the phoenix's terrible glory and understand why even the most wondrous magic carries within it the seeds of profound terror. In the depths of Hogwarts Castle, where ancient stones hold secrets older than memory, there lived a phoenix whose crimson feathers caught light that seemed to burn from within his very soul. Fawkes, companion to Albus Dumbledore, was no mere pet, but a living embodiment of cycles that most mortals dare not contemplate. His song could lift hearts or break them. His tears could heal the dying or weep for the soon-to-be dead. And his flames could warm the coldest night or consume everything that dared approach too closely. The Chamber of Secrets bore witness to Fawkes's most terrible beauty. When young Harry Potter lay dying from basilisk venom that coursed through his veins like liquid fire, in that moment of approaching death, the phoenix appeared not as salvation but as something far more complex, a creature that understood intimately the relationship between ending and beginning, between the poison that kills and the tears that heal. His arrival was not coincidence but inevitability, for phoenixes are drawn to moments of transformation, to the precise instant when life balances on the edge of death and waits to discover which way the scales will tip. The tears that saved Harry's life were not gentle drops of compassion but distilled essence of rebirth itself, each one containing the concentrated power of a creature that had died and been reborn countless times throughout the endless centuries. To be healed by phoenix tears is to taste immortality, but it is also to understand that such healing comes only to those who have already accepted death completely. The phoenix does not save the living. It resurrects those who have already begun to die, and in doing so, marks them forever with knowledge of what lies beyond the veil of mortality. But healing was only one of Fawkes's gifts that dark day in the chamber. His song, rising through the ancient stone corridors like hope made audible, carried power that went far beyond mere encouragement. Phoenix song is primal magic, the sound of creation itself, and it filled Harry with courage, not by removing his fear, but by transforming it into something useful, something that could be wielded like a weapon against the darkness that sought to claim him. The basilisk, king of serpents and dealer of death, found itself blinded by talons that carried fire in their grip, proof that even the most ancient and terrible predators could be overcome by forces older and more terrible still. The sword that appeared in the Sorting Hat was no accident either, for phoenixes exist outside normal time and space, able to see patterns and connections that mortal minds cannot grasp. Fawkes had brought not just a weapon but the right weapon, one whose goblin-made steel could absorb basilisk venom and transform poison into power. The bird understood, as Harry could not, that this battle was merely one movement in a symphony of destruction and renewal that would play out across years and decades. with consequences that would ripple through the wizarding world like stones thrown into still water. When Dumbledore fell from the astronomy tower, years later, Fawkes sang a lament that silenced Hogwarts itself. Students and teachers alike stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-breath, as that mournful song washed over them like a tide of liquid sorrow. It was not merely grief for the loss of a beloved master, but something far deeper and more terrible. The sound of a phoenix acknowledging that some deaths are not followed by rebirth, that some endings are truly final, that even creatures of eternal renewal must sometimes face the ultimate transformation that cannot be undone. The departure that followed was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, for Fawkes simply vanished into history, leaving behind no trace of his presence, save the memories of those who had witnessed his glory. Phoenixes do not belong to anyone, not truly. They choose their companions based on criteria that mortal minds cannot fathom, drawn to individuals whose destinies require the intervention of immortal flame. When that need ends, so does the relationship, and the phoenix moves on to serve purposes that may not be revealed for centuries or millennia hence. This abandonment reveals the true horror at the heart of phoenix magic, the loneliness of immortal cycles, the terrible burden of watching generations live and die while you alone continue, burning and being reborn in an endless sequence that grants perfect memory of every loss, every failure, every moment when healing came too late, or transformation demanded too high a price. To be chosen by a phoenix is both blessing and curse, for it marks you as someone whose life will require sacrifices that ordinary existence never demands. The creation of phoenix feathers for wand cause speaks to this dual nature of blessing and burden. When Ollivander crafted wands containing feathers from the same phoenix, he was not merely creating tools but forging weapons that carried within them the essence of eternal struggle between creation and destruction. The wands that chose Harry Potter and Tom Riddle were brother instruments, connected by phoenix fire that understood no distinction between light and dark magic, only the difference between power wielded with wisdom and power corrupted by fear. This connection manifested most dramatically during their duel in the graveyard, when golden flames erupted between the wands and forced them to reveal their most recent victims. The phoenix feather within each wand remembered every spell cast, every life taken or saved. And in that moment of priori incantatem, the true cost of wielding such power became visible to all who witnessed it. The dead returned as echoes, testimony to the fact that phoenix magic touches realms beyond normal understanding, places where the boundary between life and death becomes thin enough to breach. Ancient legends speak of phoenixes appearing at moments of great historical significance, not as harbingers of good fortune, but as witnesses to transformation so profound that the very fabric of reality requires their presence to remain stable. Egyptian texts describe phoenix appearances during the fall of dynasties. Greek accounts place them at the sites of oracular prophecies, and medieval chronicles record their songs during plagues that reshaped the known world. In each case, the phoenix appears not to prevent catastrophe, but to ensure that something meaningful emerges from the ashes of what has been destroyed. The breeding cycle of phoenixes, if it can be called breeding at all, occurs only under conditions that most creatures would find utterly hostile. They require temperatures that would incinerate normal life, atmospheres charged with magical energy so intense that prolonged exposure drives lesser beings insane, and most crucially, the presence of profound emotional extremes. Grief so deep it threatens to tear reality itself. Joy so pure it blazes brighter than the sun. Love so powerful it can resurrect the dead or destroy worlds to protect what it cherishes. These requirements mean that phoenix births are extraordinarily rare, separated by centuries or millennia, and always coinciding with events that reshape the magical world in fundamental ways. The appearance of a new phoenix is not cause for celebration, but for careful preparation, for their presence indicates that changes are coming, that will test every assumption and challenge every comfortable certainty that magical society has built around itself. The loyalty of a phoenix is absolute but utterly conditional, dependent not on affection or habit, but on moral alignment that operates according to principles too complex and ancient for human comprehension. They will abandon even beloved companions if those individuals begin to drift toward choices that the phoenix considers unworthy, and they will sometimes attach themselves to people who seem unlikely candidates for such honor, drawn by potential that may not manifest for decades or centuries. This selectivity has led to countless tragedies throughout magical history, as wizards and witches who believed themselves chosen by phoenix destiny discovered too late that they had misunderstood the nature of the relationship. The records of the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures contain dozens of accounts of individuals who attempted to capture, coerce, or manipulate phoenixes, and in every case, the results were catastrophic, not just for the would-be captors, but for everyone around them. Phoenix fire burns differently from normal flame, consuming not just physical matter, but spiritual essence, reducing victims not to ash but to emptiness, so complete that even their names are forgotten by those who once knew them. This is not mere death but erasure, the ultimate consequence of attempting to possess power that can only be freely given. The ashes left behind by such encounters are said to be cursed, bringing misfortune to anyone who disturbs them, for they contain the condensed weight of squandered potential and perverted destiny. Yet for all their terrible power and alien morality, phoenixes represent something beautiful beyond human understanding. The possibility that endings are not final, that destruction can serve creation, that even the darkest night will eventually give way to dawn. Their tears heal because they have wept for every tragedy in magical history. Their songs inspire courage because they remember every moment when hope seemed lost but prevailed nonetheless. Their flames burn bright because they have consumed every form of darkness and transformed it into light. The disappearance of phoenixes from the modern magical world is not coincidence but recognition that the current age lacks the moral complexity necessary to sustain their presence. They retreat to places beyond mapping, dimensions where time flows differently and cause follows effect according to laws that physics cannot describe. There they wait, patient, as only immortal creatures can be, for the day when the world will again require their terrible gifts and be prepared to pay the prices that such gifts demand. Some scholars believe that phoenixes do not truly die during their burning days, but instead shed their current incarnation like a snake sheds skin, emerging, renewed but fundamentally changed by everything they have experienced since their last rebirth. Each cycle adds layers of memory and understanding that previous incarnations did not possess, creating beings of ever-increasing wisdom and ever-deepening sorrow, for wisdom and sorrow are twins that cannot be separated in creatures that live long enough to see all patterns repeat. The songs of dying phoenixes are said to be the most beautiful and terrible sounds in existence, containing within their melodies the compressed essence of every life the phoenix has touched, every moment of triumph and tragedy they have witnessed, every drop of tears they have shed for the casualties of time's inexorable passage. To hear such a song is to understand that beauty and terror are not opposites but partners in a dance as old as magic itself, as eternal as the cycles that govern stars and seasons and the rise and fall of civilizations. In the silence that follows a phoenix's final song, when the last flame has died and the ashes begin to stir with new life, there exists a moment of perfect balance when anything becomes possible: resurrection or final ending. redemption or damnation, the birth of hope or the triumph of despair. It is in this moment that the true power of the Phoenix is revealed. Not in the magic they wield, but in the choices they inspire in others, the transformations they catalyst through their very existence. The Phoenix teaches us that some forms of beauty can only be appreciated by those willing to embrace terror, that some truths can only be understood by those brave enough to face their own mortality, and that the most profound magic always comes at costs that cannot be calculated in advance but must be paid in full regardless of their magnitude. They are creatures of paradox and possibility, living proof that in the magical world, the most dangerous powers are often indistinguishable from the most wonderful, and the greatest gifts come wrapped in flames that burn away everything we thought we knew about ourselves and leave us transformed in ways we never imagined possible. In the deepest chambers beneath Hogwarts Castle, where ancient magic seeps through stone like poison through veins, there slumbered a creature born not of nature, but of deliberate malice. The basilisk, king of serpents, emerged into existence through rituals so unnatural that even dark wizards whisper of them only in the safety of warded rooms. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your sanctuary, let us descend into the darkness where this monster waited for 1,000 years, dreaming dreams that would have driven mortal minds to madness, preparing for the day when blood and hatred would wake it from its patient sleep. The birth of a basilisk requires a perversion of life itself that speaks to the deepest corruptions magic can achieve. A chicken's egg, symbol of new life and innocence, must be placed beneath a toad during the star season of Serpentarius, incubated not by warmth and care, but by cold malevolence and ancient spite. The creature that hatches from this unholy union is wrong from its first breath, too large, too knowing, too eager to spread death through the simple act of being seen. Its scales gleam with colors that hurt the eyes. Its movements carry the fluid grace of nightmares given form, and its gaze holds power that transforms living flesh into stone with all the casualness of dawn bringing light. Salazar Slytherin, greatest of Hogwarts founders and architect of its most terrible secrets, did not create his basilisk from mere academic curiosity or even simple malice. He bred a weapon, a living embodiment of his philosophy that magical blood must remain pure regardless of the cost in innocent lives. In the deepest chamber of the castle, protected by passwords spoken in Parseltongue and sealed with magic that grew stronger with each passing year, the serpent coiled in darkness that was both physical and spiritual, fed on hatred that seeped through stone and sustained by the promise of future slaughter. The chamber itself was designed as both prison and temple, carved from living rock into shapes that pleased the basilisk's alien aesthetics, while ensuring that its power remained contained until the proper moment for release. Water flowed through channels cut into the floor, not for beauty but for acoustic perfection, ensuring that the serpent's hissing voice would carry to every corner when it finally spoke its deadly words. The walls bore carvings of serpents eating their own tails, symbols of eternal cycles that would outlast any individual life or civilization, reminders that what Slytherin had created would endure long after those who opposed him had crumbled to dust. For centuries, the basilisk dreamed in its stone sanctuary, growing larger and more terrible with each passing year. Its dreams were not the random fantasies of normal sleep, but structured visions of future hunts, detailed plans for spreading death through corridors it had never seen but somehow understood completely. It dreamed of students running in terror, of teachers falling with their eyes turned to stone, of the castle itself transformed from sanctuary into slaughterhouse where only those of proper blood would be permitted to survive. The awakening came not through accident, but through careful manipulation by one who understood both the basilisk's nature and its hunger. Tom Riddle, the boy who would become Lord Voldemort, discovered the chamber not through scholarly research but through an instinctive recognition of kindred darkness. When he first descended those ancient stairs and looked upon the Serpent King, he saw not a monster, but an opportunity, not a creature to be feared, but a weapon to be wielded by someone clever enough to understand its purpose. The conversation between boy and basilisk, conducted in Parseltongue that made the very air seem to writhe with malevolent life, was less negotiation than mutual recognition. They were alike, these two products of unnatural creation, both born from the deliberate perversion of normal magical processes, both designed to destroy what others sought to protect. The basilisk had waited 1,000 years for this moment, and Tom Riddle had spent his entire young life preparing for it without even understanding what he was preparing for. The first victim was Myrtle Warren, a Muggle-born student whose only crime was being in the wrong place when ancient hatred finally found its modern expression. She died instantly, her last sight being eyes that held no mercy, no recognition of her humanity, only the cold satisfaction of purpose finally fulfilled. The basilisk felt nothing resembling guilt or regret as life left her body and her spirit was trapped forever in the bathroom where she died, for it had been created specifically to feel nothing when killing those its master deemed unworthy of life. But the death that should have been the first of many became instead a cautionary pause as the castle's authorities began to investigate and suspicion began to fall in dangerous directions. Tom Riddle, already skilled in the arts of deception and misdirection, chose to sacrifice an innocent rather than risk exposure of his greater plans. Hagrid's expulsion and the closing of the chamber were tactical retreats, temporary setbacks in a campaign that would resume when circumstances were more favorable, and the weapon could be deployed with greater effectiveness. The 50 years of renewed slumber that followed were not empty time for the basilisk, but a period of growing strength and anticipation. It fed not on physical sustenance, but on the accumulated hatred that seeped through Hogwarts stones. The casual cruelties of students toward those they deemed inferior, the institutional prejudices that allowed such cruelties to flourish, the gradual erosion of the principles that Slytherin's fellow founders had tried to establish as permanent bulwarks against darkness. When the chamber opened again in Harry Potter's second year, it was not the same creature that had killed Myrtle Warren decades before. This basilisk was larger, stronger, more cunning, and infinitely more patient. It had learned from its previous awakening, understood the importance of stealth and misdirection, recognized that mass slaughter would bring unwanted attention, while selective targeting could spread terror far more effectively than random killing. The victims it chose during this second awakening revealed the sophistication of its hunting instincts and strategic thinking. Colin Creevey, petrified while photographing what he thought was a friend, demonstrated that even technological advancement could not protect the innocent from ancient malice. Justin Finch-Fletchley and nearly headless Nick, frozen while together, proved that neither youth nor immortality offered safety when the Serpent King chose to hunt. Hermione Granger's petrification, while researching in the library, showed that even the brightest minds could not outthink a creature that had been planning its moves for centuries. Each attack was precisely calibrated to maximize psychological impact while avoiding the fatal directness that would trigger immediate emergency response. The basilisk understood that terror was more useful than death, that living victims frozen in stone-like helplessness would spread fear more effectively than corpses, that the threat of worse to come would paralyze the castle's defenders more completely than actual mass casualties. The mirrors and reflective surfaces that saved the victims' lives were not lucky coincidences but temporary delays in an inevitable progression toward direct confrontation. The basilisk allowed these partial encounters because they served its purposes, creating witnesses who could spread word of its presence while remaining alive to suffer the psychological consequences of their narrow escapes. It was playing with its prey, demonstrating the same cruel intelligence that had made it Slytherin's perfect weapon. Missus Norris, the first victim, was chosen not for any symbolic significance, but as a test of the castle's defenses and response capabilities. The basilisk had studied the school's routines through centuries of passive observation, understood that Filch's cat was both visible enough to ensure quick discovery and insignificant enough that her petrification would be treated as mystery rather than emergency. The message written in her blood was not threat but promise, not warning but declaration of intent to resume work that had been interrupted but never abandoned. The diary that controlled much of the basilisk's strategy during this period was itself a marvel of dark magic, a fragment of Tom Riddle's soul given independent existence and malevolent purpose. Through Ginny Weasley's unwitting cooperation, it fed on her life force, while directing the basilisk's attacks with strategic precision that no normal 11-year-old could have achieved. The creature in the chamber and the presence in the diary worked in perfect coordination, each understanding its role in a plan that had been 50 years in the making. The psychology of the basilisk during this hunting period revealed depths of intelligence and cruelty that challenged every assumption about magical creature behavior. It took pleasure not just in the act of killing, but in the anticipation of killing, not just in the fear it inspired, but in the helplessness of those who tried to stop it. When it moved through the castle's plumbing, it chose routes that would maximize the psychological impact of its passage, ensuring that the sound of its movement would reach the greatest number of potential victims. The decision to take Ginny Weasley into the chamber was strategic rather than random, designed to force a confrontation under circumstances that would ensure the basilisk's victory while eliminating the one person whose survival might reveal too much about the diary's true nature. The chamber itself provided the perfect battleground, familiar territory where the serpent's advantages would be maximized and its opponent's options would be severely limited. When Harry Potter finally descended into the chamber, he faced not just a creature but a living embodiment of everything Hogwarts had been designed to prevent. The basilisk that rose to meet him was 60 feet of concentrated malevolence, a creature whose every scale had been formed by hatred, whose every movement expressed contempt for those it considered beneath notice, whose very existence was an insult to the principles of protection and education that the school represented. The battle that followed was less combat than demonstration, the basilisk displaying power that made conventional magical defenses seem pathetic by comparison. Its hide turned aside spells that would have felled dragons. Its speed made mockery of human reflexes, and its size allowed it to treat the vast chamber as a confined space where escape was impossible and victory inevitable. Only the intervention of Fawkes, whose phoenix nature allowed it to blind the basilisk without being destroyed by its gaze, prevented the encounter from ending with Harry's immediate death. Even blinded, the basilisk fought with terrifying effectiveness, guided by other senses that were nearly as acute as its lethal vision. Its hearing could track a heartbeat through stone walls. Its sense of smell could follow a trail days old through running water, and its magical awareness could detect the presence of living beings through barriers that would fool normal perception. The creature that pursued Harry through the chamber's tunnels was handicapped but far from helpless, driven by rage that made it more dangerous rather than less. The sword of Gryffindor that appeared in the Sorting Hat was the only weapon capable of penetrating the basilisk's defenses, forged with magic old enough to match the serpent's ancient malice, and imbued with properties that allowed it to absorb and concentrate the very poisons it was meant to combat. When Harry drove it through the basilisk's brain, He was not just ending a life, but breaking a connection that had existed for 1,000 years between creature and creator, severing bonds of loyalty and purpose that had sustained the monster through centuries of patient waiting. The basilisk's death was not peaceful but defiant, its final moments spent ensuring that even in defeat it would claim a victim. The fang that pierced Harry's arm delivered venom so potent that it could destroy not just flesh but soul, poison that attacked the very concept of life rather than merely ending individual existence. Only Phoenix tears, the one substance in magical creation that could neutralize basilisk venom, prevented Harry's death from completing the serpent's final victory. But death did not end the basilisk's service to darkness, for its body remained a treasury of materials too valuable and dangerous to ignore. The venom that had nearly killed Harry became the weapon that destroyed Tom Riddle's diary, the first Horcrux to fall and proof that some poisons could cure, as well as kill when applied with proper understanding. The fangs that had delivered that venom became instruments of justice, used to destroy the remaining fragments of Voldemort's shattered soul. The hide that had turned aside killing curses was harvested for armor that would protect auras in battles against dark wizards, its magical properties enhanced rather than diminished by the creature's death. The scales became components for potions that could grant temporary immunity to various forms of magical poison, while the bones were ground into powder that could neutralize cursed objects whose malevolence had proven resistant to conventional cleansing methods. Even the chamber itself was transformed by the basilisk's death, its oppressive atmosphere gradually lifting as the creature's malevolent presence faded from the stones. The water that had carried the serpent's poison was slowly purified. The carvings that had celebrated its existence began to fade, and the magical resonance that had sustained Slytherin's creation for a millennium finally began to dissipate into harmless background energy. The basilisk's legacy, however, extended far beyond its physical remains or the chamber that had housed it. Its existence had proven that some forms of magic were too dangerous to be preserved, that knowledge itself could become corrupted when applied with sufficient malice and sustained by enough hatred. The creature had been living proof that magical power without moral restraint inevitably became force for destruction rather than creation, regardless of the intelligence or skill of those who wielded it. The psychological impact on Hogwarts students lasted far longer than the physical damage caused by the basilisk's attacks. Those who had been petrified retained vivid memories of their paralysis, able to see and hear but unable to move or speak, trapped in bodies that had become prisons while terror consumed their minds. The experience left lasting trauma that no amount of magical healing could completely erase, scars on the soul that would influence their attitudes toward magical creatures for the rest of their lives. The investigation that followed the chamber's closing revealed the depth of institutional failure that had allowed the situation to develop and persist for so long. Teachers had missed signs that should have been obvious. Administrators had dismissed concerns that should have been taken seriously, and security measures had proven inadequate to protect students from threats that had literally been sleeping beneath their feet. The basilisk had succeeded in exposing weaknesses in Hogwarts' defenses that went far beyond simple magical protections. The knowledge that such creatures could be created, that they had been created, and that they might be created again, cast a shadow over magical education that would never fully lift. Students learned to question the safety of their environment, to recognize that even the most trusted institutions might harbor secrets that could prove fatal if discovered at the wrong time or by the wrong people. The basilisk had taught them that monsters were not always strangers from distant places, but sometimes products of their own heritage, darkness that had been built into the very foundations of their world. The broader magical community's reaction to news of the basilisk's existence and defeat revealed deep divisions about how such knowledge should be handled. Some argued for complete transparency, believing that only full awareness of past horrors could prevent their repetition. Others insisted on secrecy, fearing that detailed accounts of the creature's capabilities might inspire similar experiments by contemporary dark wizards. The debate raged in academic circles and government committees for years, with no clear resolution ever being reached. The chamber itself remained sealed after the basilisk's death, declared too dangerous for exploration despite the potential value of studying Slytherin's magical innovations. The decision reflected recognition that some knowledge was too corrupting to be preserved, that the methods used to create and control the basilisk were themselves weapons that could not be safely studied or understood. The greatest of Hogwarts founders had left behind a legacy too terrible to be fully explored. In the years that followed, the story of the basilisk became both cautionary tale and inspiration, depending on who told it and why. For some, it represented proof that good could triumph over evil through courage and sacrifice, that even the most terrible monsters could be defeated by those willing to pay the necessary price. For others, it demonstrated the enduring power of hatred and prejudice, the way that ancient malice could reach across centuries to claim new victims if vigilance was ever relaxed. The Serpent King's reign of terror had lasted only months in total across both awakenings, but its impact resonated through the magical world for decades afterward. Students at magical schools throughout the world learned about basilisks not just as dangerous creatures to be avoided, but as symbols of what happened when power was divorced from wisdom, when magical ability was used to serve hatred rather than healing, when the gifts of magic were perverted into instruments of genocide and terror. The basilisk story became required study for aspiring aurors who needed to understand not just the creature's physical capabilities, but the psychological mindset that had created and deployed it. They learned to recognize the signs of such corruption in their own time, to identify individuals whose magical research might be trending towards similar abominations, to prevent the creation of new monsters before they could emerge from whatever chambers might conceal them. But perhaps the most important lesson the basilisk taught was about the nature of evil itself, that it was not always dramatically obvious or theatrically malevolent, but sometimes patient, intelligent, and willing to wait centuries for the perfect moment to strike. The creature in the chamber had not been a mindless beast, but a thinking being whose thoughts were devoted entirely to perfecting techniques for causing suffering and death. Its intelligence had made it more dangerous, not less, because it could plan and adapt and learn from its mistakes. The last words spoken in Parseltongue within the Chamber of Secrets were not commands or threats, but something approaching gratitude, as the dying basilisk acknowledged the worthy opponent who had finally provided it with a battle challenging enough to be remembered. In death, the Serpent King found something it had never experienced in life: respect for the courage of those who opposed it, recognition that true strength sometimes lay in protection rather than destruction, understanding that its own existence had been hollow precisely because it had been devoted entirely to ending the existence of others. The chamber fell silent then, its 1,000-year conversation between founder and monster finally concluded, its purpose fulfilled, not through the triumph of hatred, but through its ultimate defeat by forces that the basilisk had been created, specifically to overcome, but had never truly understood until the moment when understanding came too late to change anything except the manner of its dying. In the remote mountains where mist clings to jagged peaks like the breath of sleeping gods, there exist creatures whose very existence challenges every comfortable assumption about the relationship between magic and mortality. Dragons, those magnificent engines of destruction wrapped in scales harder than steel and powered by hearts that burn with literal fire, represent the ultimate expression of nature's capacity for creating beauty that can kill with casual indifference. Tonight, as you nestle deeper into safety and warmth, let us journey to those forbidden heights where these living infernos make their lairs, and understand why even the bravest wizards speak their names in whispers, weighted with equal measures of awe and terror. The Hungarian horntail stands as perhaps the most feared of all dragon breeds, a creature whose black scales seem to absorb light itself while reflecting back only menace and barely contained violence. Its tail, adorned with bronze-colored spikes that can pierce through the strongest magical shields, moves with serpentine grace that belies the devastating power contained within each casual gesture. When a horntail spreads its wings, the shadow that falls across the landscape below carries with it the promise of incineration. For these creatures do not merely breathe fire, but exhale concentrated destruction that can melt stone to slag and turn sand to glass in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The nesting behavior of dragons reveals intelligence that makes their destructive capabilities even more terrifying, for they are not mindless beasts driven by instinct alone, but thinking predators capable of strategy, planning, and long-term revenge. A mother horntail protecting her eggs becomes a force of nature, given malevolent purpose, her territorial instincts amplified by magical enhancement that allows her to sense intruders from distances that would challenge the most sophisticated detection spells. She does not simply attack trespassers, but hunts them with methodical precision, learning their patterns and weaknesses, before striking with timing, calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage, along with physical destruction. The eggs themselves pulse with inner fire that speaks to the terrible beauty of draconic reproduction, each one containing a developing creature whose first breath will be flame hot enough to ignite the very air around it. The incubation period stretches across seasons, during which the mother's protective fury grows stronger rather than weaker, fed by magical energies that flow through the earth itself and accumulate in deposits that transform ordinary landscapes into territories of supernatural danger. Those who have observed dragon nesting grounds from safe distances report that the very stones begin to glow with residual heat, that plants wither not from flame, but from proximity to emotions, too intense for normal matter to withstand. Charlie Weasley, whose work on the Romanian Dragon Reserve has earned him scars that map like constellations across his arms and shoulders, understands better than most the paradox of dragon nature. Their intelligence makes them more dangerous rather than less, because they remember every slight, every intrusion, every moment when their dominance was challenged or questioned. His reports speak of dragons who recognize individual handlers from distances measured in miles, who harbor grudges that span decades, who demonstrate problem-solving abilities that rival those of the most brilliant human minds, while applying those abilities exclusively to questions of how best to eliminate perceived threats. The Norwegian Ridgeback presents different challenges, for this breed breathes fire from the moment of hatching, turning the normal vulnerabilities of youth into weapons that catch even experienced dragon handlers unprepared. Baby Ridgebacks are not cute or harmless, but concentrated packages of destruction whose every sneeze can set wooden buildings ablaze, whose playful nips can sever fingers, whose innocent curiosity about their environment expresses itself through systematic incineration of everything within reach. Hagrid's brief attempt to raise Norbert demonstrated the folly of treating dragons as oversized pets, for creatures born with flame in their throats and violence in their hearts cannot be domesticated through kindness or patience alone. The intelligence that makes dragons so terrifying also makes them magnificent in ways that transcend simple physical beauty, for they are among the few creatures in the magical world whose understanding of their own power approaches the philosophical. Ancient dragons, those who have survived centuries of conflicts with wizards and other magical beings, develop wisdom that borders on the prophetic, able to recognize patterns in magical energy that escape detection by the most sophisticated instruments. They understand their place in the ecosystem of magical Britain, not as simple predators, but as apex forces whose very presence shapes the behavior of every other creature within hundreds of miles. The Chinese fireball, despite its name suggesting mere pyrotechnic display, possesses perhaps the most refined destructive capabilities of any dragon breed, able to direct its flames with precision that allows for surgical strikes against specific targets while leaving surrounding areas untouched. This control makes them particularly dangerous in conflicts with human settlements, for they can eliminate defensive positions with minimal collateral damage to valuable resources, demonstrating strategic thinking that military commanders would recognize and respect if they were not too busy fleeing for their lives. The Welsh Green, often dismissed as the least aggressive of dragon breeds, reveals its true nature only when circumstances demand maximum lethality, transforming from relatively docile creature into killing machine with speed that leaves observers struggling to understand how they could have so completely misjudged the situation. This capacity for rapid escalation makes Welsh Greens perhaps more dangerous than their more obviously violent cousins, for they lull potential threats into false confidence before demonstrating that dragon restraint is courtesy extended to inferiors rather than evidence of weakness or submission. Swedish short snouts compensate for their relatively compact size, with breath weapons that burn at temperatures approaching those found at the cores of stars, flames so intense that it exists at the boundary between physical fire and pure magical energy. Their silver blue scales, prized by potion makers and armor crafters throughout the magical world, provide protection against most forms of magical attack, while reflecting incoming spells in directions that transform defensive mechanisms into offensive weapons. A short snout under attack becomes a living prism of destruction, turning its opponent's magic against them with efficiency that approaches artistry in its elegant lethality. The black market trade in dragon parts reveals the extent to which these creatures are valued not just for their power but for their utility. Every scale and fang and drop of blood representing components that can enhance magical abilities in ways that no other substances can match. Dragon blood's 12 uses, discovered by Dumbledore during his alchemical research, represent only a fraction of the creature's potential contributions to magical advancement, but harvesting such materials requires accepting risks that have claimed the lives of countless professional collectors over the centuries. The process of obtaining dragon blood safely requires teams of specialists working in carefully choreographed sequences that account for the creature's ability to remain dangerous even when unconscious or apparently incapacitated. Dragon biology operates according to magical principles that make conventional medical understanding useless, for their hearts continue beating with supernatural regularity, even after sustaining injuries that would kill any other creature instantly. Their nervous systems distribute control throughout their bodies in ways that allow them to remain partially functional even when suffering catastrophic damage to what appear to be vital organs. Wand cores made from dragon heartstring produce instruments of magical focusing that amplify their wielder's power to degrees that can overwhelm unprepared users, creating wands that are eager for battle and impatient with subtle magic that does not involve impressive displays of force. The connection between wizard and dragon core wand becomes a partnership between human intelligence and draconic aggression, often resulting in magical styles that emphasize decisive action over careful consideration, overwhelming power over elegant technique. The Triwizard Tournament's first task revealed the folly of treating dragons as mere obstacles to be overcome through cleverness and preparation, for the creatures selected for the competition were not random specimens, but mature adults, whose territorial instincts had been deliberately provoked to ensure maximum danger for the participating champions. The golden eggs they guarded represented more than tournament objectives, but symbols of everything dragons value most, triggering protective responses that transformed the task from academic exercise into genuine combat with creatures whose defeat was impossible and whose anger was absolute. Harry Potter's aerial duel with the Hungarian Horntail demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of human magical abilities when confronted with draconic power, his success dependent not on overcoming the dragon, but on outmaneuvering it long enough to achieve his objective and escape before the creature's superior endurance and raw power could be brought to bear effectively. The firebolt that carried him through that encounter was pushed to its absolute limits, its magical enhancements strained by the need to maintain speeds that could keep ahead of flame that moved faster than most spells could be cast. The psychological impact on spectators who witnessed that confrontation extended far beyond simple entertainment. For many reported dreams filled with fire and wings, nightmares in which they found themselves trapped in arenas with creatures whose eyes held intelligence that made their lethal capabilities even more terrifying. The dragon's roars during the task were not mere expressions of anger, but complex vocalizations that conveyed meaning in frequencies that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to primal fears buried in the deepest parts of human psychology. Dragon reserves like the one in Romania exist not to protect wizards from dragons, but to protect dragons from the consequences of their own nature, containing creatures whose territorial ranges would otherwise encompass entire countries and whose feeding requirements would devastate local ecosystems. The magical barriers that surround these reserves must be constantly maintained and regularly upgraded, for dragon intelligence includes understanding of magical theory sufficient to identify and exploit weaknesses in containment systems that their designers believed were foolproof. Escape attempts from dragon reserves are rare but catastrophic when they occur, for loose dragons do not simply wander randomly but move toward objectives that their alien intelligence has identified as worthy of their attention. A dragon that has decided to investigate human magical capabilities will do so with systematic thoroughness that treats entire cities as laboratories for experiments that no ethical considerations can constrain or moderate. The breeding programs maintained at these reserves walk the razor's edge between preserving endangered species and creating weapons that could reshape the balance of power in magical conflicts. For baby dragons raised in captivity retain all the destructive capabilities of their wild cousins, while potentially developing familiarity with human presence that makes them even more dangerous when they eventually mature and assert their independence. Each successful hatching represents both conservation triumph and potential catastrophe. New life that carries within it the power to end countless other lives. Dragon social structures, observed from distances that still prove frequently inadequate for researcher survival, reveal hierarchies based not on age or size, but on demonstrated capacity for destruction, with leadership roles going to individuals whose territorial claims encompass the largest areas of scorched earth and whose reputations for violence discourage challenges from potential rivals. These alpha dragons develop magical abilities that surpass those of their subordinates, breathing flames that burn in colors that normal fire cannot achieve and demonstrating resistances to spells that would incapacitate lesser members of their species. Communication between dragons occurs through combinations of vocalizations, magical emanations, and territorial markings that create complex networks of information exchange spanning entire mountain ranges, allowing coordinated responses to threats that individual dragons could not handle alone. When multiple dragons combine their efforts, the results can alter weather patterns, trigger avalanches, or create magical storms that persist for weeks after the dragons themselves have moved on to other concerns. The relationship between dragons and human magical development reveals troubling parallels between draconic territorial expansion and wizarding colonization, both species demonstrating tendencies to claim resources they consider rightfully theirs, while dismissing the claims of creatures they consider inferior. This competition for magical territory has resulted in conflicts that are carefully omitted from most historical accounts, battles whose outcomes shaped the current distribution of both populations in ways that neither side fully acknowledges or understands. Ancient dragon hordes, discovered in caves whose entrances have been sealed by geological activity or magical catastrophe, reveal the extent to which these creatures value beauty alongside power, collecting objects whose aesthetic appeal transcends their practical utility. These treasures demonstrate dragon artistic sensibilities that recognize patterns and relationships that human appreciation cannot fully grasp, suggesting forms of intelligence that operate according to principles fundamentally different from those that govern human consciousness. The magical theory that explains dragonfire's properties requires understanding of energy conversion processes that push the boundaries of what current magical science considers possible. Flames that burn not just matter, but magical essence itself, capable of destroying enchantments that were designed to be permanent and dissolving protective spells that should have been proof against any physical attack. This fire burns at temperatures that exist beyond normal measurement, heat that affects not just objects but concepts, flame that can incinerate abstract ideas along with physical targets. Dragon longevity complicates every attempt to understand their true nature. For creatures that live for centuries, develop perspectives on time and change that make their decision-making processes appear incomprehensible to beings whose lifespans are measured in mere decades. A dragon's response to current events may be influenced by grudges or obligations that were established before the birth of the oldest living wizard, creating behavioral patterns that seem random but follow logic based on information that no human possesses or could meaningfully interpret. The evolutionary pressure that shaped dragon development operated on timescales that dwarf human civilization, creating creatures whose every adaptation was tested against challenges that included ice ages, magical catastrophes, and conflicts with entities whose power approached that of gods. Modern dragons are the survivors of selection processes so intensive that their current capabilities represent the minimum requirements for continued existence rather than evolutionary advantages that might be considered excessive. The fire that defines dragon nature burns with intensity that transcends mere combustion, flame that exists at the intersection of physical and magical reality, heat that can affect objects in dimensions beyond the three that normal human senses can perceive. This fire burns through time itself, leaving scars on reality that persist long after the flames have been extinguished, creating zones of magical disturbance that influence local conditions for centuries after the dragon responsible has moved elsewhere or died. In the deepest caves where ancient dragons make their final lairs, surrounded by hordes that represent lifetimes of careful collection, and protected by magical defenses that have been refined across centuries of paranoid preparation, these magnificent creatures await the end of ages with patience that mortal minds cannot comprehend. They are living bridges between the current magical world and epochs when power operated according to rules that no longer apply, guardians of secrets whose revelation could reshape reality itself or destroy it entirely in the process of transformation. The lesson dragons teach is that some forms of beauty are too dangerous to approach, some power too great to be safely wielded, and some intelligence too alien to be fully understood by minds that have not been forged in fires that burn at the heart of creation itself. They are reminders that the magical world contains forces that dwarf human ambition and capability, creatures whose casual breath can end civilizations and whose dreams can alter the fundamental nature of reality according to whims that mortals can never predict or influence. In the coldest corners of the magical world, where light itself seems to flee in terror and warmth becomes nothing more than a distant memory, there drift creatures whose very existence transforms hope into despair, with the casual efficiency of winter killing flowers. Dementors, those hooded harbingers of emptiness, represent more than mere magical predators. They are living embodiments of depression itself, hunger given form and purpose, void made manifest in shapes that glide through darkness like nightmares escaping the boundaries of sleep. Tonight, as you pull comfort closer around yourself like armor against the dark, let us explore these creatures whose touch can steal not just happiness, but the very memory of what happiness feels like, leaving behind only the echoing emptiness of souls that have forgotten how to feel anything but fear. The nature of Dementor existence defies every comfortable assumption about life and death, for these creatures occupy a space between states that should be mutually exclusive. They are neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something far more terrible. Entities that feed on the life force of others, while contributing nothing to the world except absence. Creatures whose presence creates voids in reality where joy cannot exist and hope becomes impossible to sustain. Their forms, shrouded in tattered robes that seem woven from shadow itself, suggest shapes that were once human, but have been so thoroughly corrupted by their feeding that humanity has been burned away, leaving only the insatiable hunger that defines their existence. The feeding process that sustains Dementor existence reveals the sophisticated cruelty at the heart of their nature, for they do not simply drain happiness like parasites drawing blood, but actively transform positive emotions into their opposites, converting love into loneliness, hope into despair, courage into terror through metabolic processes that corrupt the very essence of what makes life worth living. This transformation is not random but deliberate, each Dementor possessing instinctive understanding of which memories will cause the most pain when twisted, which emotions will create the deepest wounds when inverted, which aspects of their victim's identity will shatter most completely when subjected to their particular form of assault. The proximity effect that allows Dementors to drain happiness without physical contact operates through magical mechanisms that bypass every normal defense, for their influence seeps through protective charms, penetrates magical barriers, and overwhelms resistance through simple persistence rather than overwhelming power. Victims report that the approach of a Dementor feels like walking into a wall of invisible ice, sensation that begins as mild discomfort and escalates rapidly to complete psychological paralysis as memories of trauma surface with vivid intensity, while recollections of joy fade into grey indistinction that makes it impossible to remember why life ever seemed worth living. The graduated nature of Dementor feeding creates a spectrum of victimization that ranges from temporary depression to complete spiritual destruction, with the creature's appetite determining how much damage is inflicted during any particular encounter. Light feeding might leave a victim feeling melancholy for days or weeks, while intensive exposure can result in permanent psychological scarring that no amount of magical healing can completely repair. The most severe encounters, short of the kiss itself, leave survivors who no longer remember what their own voices sound like when they laugh, who cannot recall the faces of people they love, without effort that exhausts them, who find themselves unable to experience pleasure in activities that once brought them profound satisfaction. Azkaban prison's use of Dementors as guards represented one of the most systematic applications of psychological torture in recorded magical history, a decision that transformed legal punishment into spiritual annihilation, while maintaining the fiction that inmates were being held rather than destroyed. The fortress itself became permeated with Dementor influence over the centuries of their residence, its stones absorbing despair, until the very architecture radiated hopelessness that affected visitors within minutes of arrival and left permanent marks on anyone who spent extended time within its walls. Prisoners subjected to years of Dementor exposure underwent transformations that went far beyond simple madness, becoming hollow shells whose personalities had been so thoroughly drained that they could barely remember their own names, much less the crimes that had brought them to that terrible place. These victims moved through their cells like ghosts haunting their own bodies, speaking in whispers to people who existed only in memories that grew fainter with each passing day, clinging to fragments of identity that the Dementors had not yet found valuable enough to consume completely. The psychological reports compiled by healers who treated former Azkaban inmates reveal the systematic nature of Dementor feeding patterns, with creatures showing preference for memories that combine strong emotional content with personal significance, targeting recollections of first loves, childhood happiness, family gatherings, and moments of personal triumph, while leaving intact memories of trauma, loss, failure, and regret. This selective consumption creates victims whose mental landscapes become dominated by negative experiences while positive counterbalances are systematically removed, resulting in worldviews so thoroughly poisoned that recovery becomes nearly impossible even after the Dementor influence is removed. The breeding or multiplication process that allows Dementors to increase their numbers remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in magical creature studies, for these entities appear to reproduce through mechanisms that involve the corruption of existing souls rather than conventional biological processes. Areas that experience prolonged Dementor presence begin generating new Dementors spontaneously, as if despair itself reaches critical mass and spontaneously generates physical forms capable of spreading further suffering. This phenomenon suggests that Dementors are not simply predators but agents of transformation, creatures whose ultimate purpose involves converting the entire world into a realm suitable for their kind, while eliminating forms of consciousness that depend on positive emotions for survival. The Dementor's kiss represents the ultimate expression of their feeding capabilities, a process that goes beyond draining happiness to completely removing the victim's soul, while leaving the body technically alive, but utterly empty. Witnesses to kiss administration report that victims appear to deflate slightly, as if some essential substance has been removed from their physical forms, while their eyes become vacant in ways that suggest looking at spaces where people used to exist rather than at actual human beings. These hollow shells continue biological processes for years or decades after their souls are consumed, breathing and eating and sleeping, but demonstrating no awareness of their own existence or recognition of their surroundings. The souls consumed through the kiss do not simply disappear but become part of the Dementor that devoured them, adding their memories and emotional capacity to the creature's growing reservoir of stolen experiences while being themselves transformed into components of the hunger that defines Dementor existence. This process means that every Dementor carries within itself the remnants of hundreds or thousands of personalities, creating entities whose psychological complexity approaches the incomprehensible while remaining focused entirely on the consumption of additional victims. Harry Potter's unusual sensitivity to Dementor presence stemmed from traumatic memories that were both exceptionally intense and psychologically unprocessed, creating emotional wounds that Dementors found irresistible while providing them with access to levels of despair that most victims could not supply. His encounters with these creatures triggered not just personal terror, but reliving of his parents' murder with sensory detail that his conscious mind had suppressed, forcing him to experience their final moments with adult understanding of their significance while being flooded with emotions too powerful for his psychological defenses to contain. The Patronus charm that serves as the primary defense against Dementor attack requires not just magical skill, but psychological preparation that most wizards find impossible to achieve under the stress of actual encounter, for the charm depends on summoning genuine happiness while experiencing the active drain of positive emotions that defines Dementor proximity. The silvery guardians produced by successful casting represent concentrated positive memory given semi-physical form, creatures of light and joy that can drive back entities of darkness and despair through simple incompatibility rather than superior power. The difficulty of maintaining a Patronus during extended Dementor exposure reveals the fundamental challenge these creatures present, for they make their own defeat progressively more difficult by draining the very emotions required to resist them effectively. Victims find themselves caught in psychological spirals where increasing despair makes successful casting less likely, while failed attempts to produce defensive magic increase feelings of helplessness that make subsequent efforts even more difficult to sustain. The animals that serve as Patronus forms reflect deep aspects of their casters' personalities, while also determining the effectiveness of protection against different types of Dementor attack, with larger and more aggressive forms, providing better defense against sustained assault, while more agile forms offering superior protection during pursuit situations. The corporeal nature of fully formed Patronuses allows them to engage Dementors in something approaching physical combat, though the interaction occurs on magical rather than material levels and follows rules that normal physics cannot adequately describe. The defection of many Dementors to Voldemort's service during his rise to power demonstrated the creature's alignment with forces that promised maximum opportunities for feeding rather than any genuine political ideology or personal loyalty, for Dementors lack the capacity for abstract reasoning required to understand political concepts while possessing instinctive attraction to situations that generate the despair and terror on which they sustain themselves. Their presence in Death Eater ranks transformed battles from magical conflicts into psychological warfare, creating environments where enemy combatants might be defeated without direct engagement, simply through exposure to the crushing depression that Dementors generated through their mere presence. The strategic deployment of Dementors as weapons revealed their effectiveness against large populations, for creatures that could drain morale from entire communities while remaining largely invulnerable to conventional magical attack represented force multipliers that could alter the outcome of conflicts through psychological rather than physical superiority. Towns that found themselves under Dementor attack experienced not just immediate casualties but complete social collapse as residents lost the emotional capacity for cooperation, mutual support, or collective resistance to occupation. The aftermath of Dementor attacks on civilian populations created refugee crises that strained magical medical resources to breaking points, for victims required specialized treatment that combined magical healing with psychological rehabilitation while dealing with spiritual wounds that conventional therapy could not address. Entire families were left shattered, not by physical separation but by members' inability to remember why they had once cared about each other. Communities were destroyed not through violence but through the loss of emotional connections that had previously held them together. The resistance networks that developed techniques for operating in Dementor-occupied territory had to completely reimagine their approaches to organization and communication, developing methods that did not depend on positive emotions or personal loyalty, while finding ways to maintain operational effectiveness despite the crushing psychological pressure of constant exposure to creatures whose presence made hope itself seem like naive delusion. These groups learned to function through duty and habit rather than inspiration, creating structures that could persist even when their members could no longer remember why their cause mattered. The long-term environmental effects of Dementor presence extend far beyond immediate psychological damage, creating zones of magical corruption where normal spells function poorly and positive emotions become difficult to sustain even years after the creatures have moved elsewhere. Plants in these areas grow in stunted, twisted forms that suggest they are struggling against influences that attack the fundamental life processes, while animals avoid regions that retain Dementor contamination with instinctive wisdom that recognizes dangers their conscious minds cannot identify or understand. The magical theory that explains Dementor abilities suggests creatures that exist partially outside normal space and time. Entities whose feeding processes involve manipulating temporal flows to access victims' memories from multiple points in their personal timelines simultaneously. This would explain their ability to surface traumatic experiences with perfect clarity while making positive memories seem distant and unreal, for they may literally be drawing their victim's consciousness backward to moments of maximum vulnerability, while severing connections to periods of happiness and strength. The question of Dementor origins remains one of the most troubling mysteries in magical creature research, for no natural evolutionary process could have produced entities whose every characteristic seems designed to cause maximum psychological damage to human consciousness, while providing no apparent benefit to any ecosystem or magical community. Some scholars theorize that Dementors are artificial creations, weapons developed by ancient dark wizards who sought to weaponize despair itself, while others suggest they may be invasive species from dimensions where emotional energy flows according to different principles than those that govern our reality. The study of Dementor behavior patterns reveals intelligence that operates according to principles completely alien to human consciousness, for these creatures demonstrate problem-solving abilities and strategic thinking, while apparently lacking any motivation except hunger and any emotion except the drive to feed. They coordinate their activities with precision that suggests communication methods beyond normal magical detection, while pursuing objectives that seem designed to maximize suffering rather than simply obtain sustenance, implying purposes that go beyond mere survival and enter realms of deliberate malevolence. The psychological profiles compiled by researchers who have survived extended observation of Dementor colonies describe entities whose thought processes, insofar as they can be understood, focus entirely on identifying and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities in potential victims, while developing increasingly sophisticated methods for overcoming defensive magic and psychological resistance. These creatures appear to learn from each feeding encounter, accumulating knowledge about human psychology that makes them progressively more effective predators while remaining utterly indifferent to the suffering they cause, except as indicators of successful hunting. The magical resonance that allows Dementors to affect their environment extends beyond simple emotional drainage to encompass alterations in local magical fields that make certain types of spells more difficult to cast, while enhancing the effectiveness of magic related to fear, despair, and spiritual manipulation. Areas under sustained Dementor influence become hostile to healing magic, protective charms, and spells that depend on positive emotional states while becoming more receptive to curses, hexes, and other forms of harmful magic that align with the creature's fundamental nature. The social implications of Dementor existence force uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and punishment in magical society, for the use of creatures that feed on human happiness, as prison guards represents acceptance of torture, methods that go beyond physical cruelty to attack the fundamental psychological processes that define human consciousness. The decision to employ Dementors in official capacity required moral compromises that corrupted the entire justice system while creating precedents that made other forms of officially sanctioned cruelty seem reasonable by comparison. In the years following Voldemort's defeat, when Dementors were removed from official service and attempts were made to contain them in isolated reservations, the creatures demonstrated their inability to accept limitations on their feeding by systematically breaking containment and seeking new population centers where they could resume their harvest of human misery. These escape incidents revealed that Dementors could not be reformed, contained, or reasoned with, but only driven away through applications of force that required constant vigilance and enormous expenditure of magical resources, while providing no guarantee of permanent solution. The continuing presence of Dementors in the world serves as a reminder that some forms of evil cannot be defeated through conventional means, but only resisted through constant effort and unwavering commitment to maintaining hope despite evidence that despair might be the more rational response to reality. They are living arguments for nihilism and surrendering to despair, creatures whose existence seems designed to prove that positive emotions are illusions and happiness is temporary delusion that only serves to make eventual suffering more acute when circumstances inevitably change for the worse. Yet in the darkness that Dementors bring, there exists also proof of human resilience and the power of conscious choice to determine response to circumstances beyond individual control. For those who learn to produce Patronuses, discover that happiness need not depend on external conditions, but can be summoned from internal resources that no external force can completely destroy. The silver light that drives back Dementor darkness represents not naive optimism, but hard-won wisdom about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of finding meaning, even in the presence of entities that exist specifically to prove that meaning is impossible and hope is cruel, deception that only prolongs inevitable suffering. The Dementors drift still through the darkest corners of the world, patient as death itself and hungry as the void between stars, waiting for moments when vigilance fails and hope weakens enough to allow them close enough to feed. They are reminders that consciousness itself can become weapon when wielded by entities that understand how to transform the mind's greatest strengths into sources of unbearable vulnerability. Creatures whose existence challenges every comfortable assumption about the relationship between awareness and suffering, while offering lessons about the nature of courage that can only be learned by those brave enough to face the relationship. Possibility that happiness might be nothing more than temporary, absence of despair. In the deepest reaches of the forbidden forest, where ancient trees lean together like conspirators sharing secrets too terrible for daylight, there exists a colony whose very presence transforms the familiar darkness of woodland shadow into something far more sinister and predatory. Here, among webs that stretch between towering oaks like silver highways designed by nightmare architects, live creatures whose intelligence makes their hunger infinitely more terrifying than simple animal appetite could ever be. Acromantulas, those speaking spiders whose voices carry the cadence of human conversation while their eyes reflect only the cold calculation of perfect predators, represent perhaps the most unsettling fusion of familiar intelligence and alien malevolence that the magical world has ever produced. The patriarch of this nightmare colony was Aragog, a creature whose size dwarfed the largest magical beasts, while his voice carried the cultured tones of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of civilized conversation. When Harry Potter and Ron Weasley first encountered him in that moonlit clearing, surrounded by offspring whose eyes glittered like malevolent stars in the darkness, they discovered that intelligence could make a monster infinitely more terrifying rather than less. For Aragog spoke of friendship and loyalty, while his children gathered in the shadows with the patient hunger of creatures who understood that dinner conversations were merely social niceties that preceded the main course of actual consumption. The creation of acromantulas speaks to magical experimentation that pushed the boundaries of ethical creature breeding far beyond any reasonable limit. For these spiders were not natural evolution, but deliberate fusion of human cognitive abilities with arachnid physiology, resulting in beings that possessed the problem-solving capabilities of advanced magical minds, while retaining every instinct and appetite that made spiders such efficient killers. The wizards who first bred these creatures had sought to create intelligent servants, but they had instead manufactured nightmares that could think, plan, and coordinate their hunting with strategic sophistication that made them more dangerous than dragons despite their comparatively smaller individual size. Hagrid's protection of Aragog during his Hogwarts years represented perhaps the most dangerous example of misplaced compassion in recorded magical education history, for his inability to recognize the fundamental nature of acromantula psychology led him to treat a developing apex predator as though it was simply an unusually large pet with dietary preferences that could be managed through adequate feeding. The young spider that had once seemed merely exotic became a creature whose gratitude toward his protector was the only thing preventing him from viewing the entire human population of Hogwarts as potential prey, creating a situation where the safety of hundreds of students depended on the continued goodwill of a monster whose natural instincts were devoted entirely to hunting and consumption. The accusation that Aragog was the monster from the Chamber of Secrets revealed how even false associations could carry weight when dealing with creatures whose true nature was sufficiently terrible that fictional crimes seemed plausible. By comparison, the spider's denial of responsibility for the petrifications was honest but misleading, for while he had not been Slytherin's creature, his mere presence in the castle had represented a threat potentially greater than the basilisk itself, since a breeding population of acromantulas could have overrun Hogwarts within years, rather than remaining dormant for centuries between attacks. The colony that grew from Aragog's exile to the Forbidden Forest became a kingdom of silk and shadow that transformed entire sections of ancient woodland into hunting grounds where every strand of web served as both trap and communication network, allowing the spiders to coordinate their activities across territories measured in square miles rather than individual trees. The intelligence that made acromantulas such terrifying predators also made them efficient colonizers, capable of analyzing ecosystem dynamics and identifying optimal expansion strategies that maximize their hunting success, while minimizing conflicts with other dangerous magical creatures who might pose threats to their developing CB. Dominance. The web networks that acromantulas construct extend far beyond simple hunting snares to encompass communication systems that rival the most sophisticated magical methods for transmitting information across distances, with vibrations traveling through silk strands, carrying messages encoded in frequencies that allow for complex coordination between colony members. These networks enable hunting strategies that would be impossible for individual spiders, with groups working together to drive prey toward predetermined kill zones, while other colony members prepare ambush positions designed to prevent escape, regardless of the victim's speed, magical abilities, or defensive preparations. The feeding habits of acromantulas reveal appetites that go beyond simple nutritional requirements to encompass preferences for prey that can provide entertainment value through attempts at resistance. for these creatures appear to derive psychological satisfaction from the hunt itself rather than merely viewing it as necessary survival activity. Victims report being kept alive in cocoon wrappings for extended periods, while spiders debate among themselves the most interesting methods of consumption. Discussions that demonstrate not just intelligence, but a form of aesthetic appreciation for suffering that makes their behavior far more disturbing than simple predatory violence would be. The reproduction cycle of acromantulas creates exponential population growth that can transform small founding groups into overwhelming swarms within remarkably short timeframes, with each female capable of producing egg sacs containing hundreds of offspring, whose survival rates in magical environments are dramatically higher than those of normal spiders due to their enhanced intelligence and cooperative hunting behaviors. These rapid reproduction cycles mean that acromantula infestations can progress from barely noticeable presence to ecological dominance within single breeding seasons, creating situations where entire forest ecosystems become restructured around the needs and preferences of spider colonies. The intelligence that defines acromantula psychology operates according to principles that combine human-like reasoning abilities with value systems that remain fundamentally arachnid, resulting in creatures that can engage in sophisticated philosophical discussions about the nature of friendship and loyalty, while simultaneously planning the most efficient methods for consuming their conversation partners. This cognitive duality makes them particularly dangerous to humans, who tend to interpret verbal sophistication as evidence of moral development, while failing to recognize that acromantulas use language as just another hunting tool designed to manipulate prey into vulnerable positions. The relationship between Hagrid and Aragog demonstrated the limitations of interspecies friendship when one party's fundamental nature includes viewing the other party's species as food source. For the spider's restraint in not eating his protector represented constant effort against instinctive drives rather than genuine affection or moral consideration. Aragog's children, who had not experienced the specific circumstances that created their father's unusual attachment to a human, felt no such restraint and viewed Hagrid's visits as opportunities to evaluate potential meals while being prevented from acting on their assessments only by parental authority that they respected but did not understand. When Harry and Ron encountered the colony during their second year, they discovered that acromantula hospitality consisted of polite conversation followed by attempted consumption, with the spiders treating their guests' visit as both social occasion and feeding opportunity. The creature's ability to shift seamlessly from civilized discourse to predatory attack revealed the superficial nature of their apparent domestication, demonstrating that intelligence without empathy creates monsters more sophisticated, but not less dangerous than those driven purely by instinct. The flying Ford Anglia that rescued the boys from certain death provided salvation that was both miraculous and temporary, for the car's intervention merely postponed rather than eliminated the acromantula threat, while simultaneously revealing the extent to which the spider colony had grown beyond Hagrid's ability to control or influence. The creatures that pursued them through the forest moved with coordination that suggested military organization rather than simple pack hunting, using flanking maneuvers and tactical positioning that would have impressed professional soldiers if they had not been too busy fleeing for their lives to appreciate the strategic sophistication of their pursuers. The death of Aragog, years later, removed the only restraining influence on a colony that had grown to encompass thousands of individual spiders, whose collective intelligence and hunting capability represented a threat to every living creature within dozens of miles of their territory. The patriarch's final words to Hagrid, expressing gratitude for decades of protection, while explicitly releasing his offspring from any obligation to extend similar courtesy to other humans, demonstrated the purely transactional nature of acromantula loyalty and the dangers inherent in assuming that gratitude would extend beyond the specific individuals who had earned it. The funeral that Hagrid organized for Aragog revealed both his genuine grief for a creature he had considered a friend and his dangerous naivety about the nature of the threat that Kreacher's death would unleash upon the wizarding world. The gathering of spiders that should have been a solemn memorial became instead a strategic planning session where colony leadership was redistributed and territorial expansion plans were finalized without regard for the safety of human populations who would be affected by their decisions. The Battle of Hogwarts provided the Acromantula colony with an unprecedented opportunity to engage in large-scale hunting without fear of organized retaliation, as the chaos and confusion of warfare created ideal conditions for predators who thrived on terror and confusion, while possessing enough intelligence to distinguish between tactical opportunities and strategic mistakes. The spiders that descended upon the battlefield did not discriminate between Death Eaters and defenders, but treated all human combatants as equally acceptable prey, demonstrating their complete indifference to the political and moral issues that had created the conflict. The weapons that Acromantulas brought to battle were not magical implements, but biological capabilities that had been refined through generations of successful hunting, with venom that could paralyze victims while keeping them conscious and aware of their fate, webs that were stronger than most magical bonds and nearly impossible to break through conventional spells, and coordination abilities that allowed them to function as unified military unit. Despite their large numbers and distributed command structure, the terror that Acromantulas inspired on the battlefield went beyond simple fear of death to encompass horror at the prospect of being consumed alive by creatures intelligent enough to understand their victims' suffering while being utterly indifferent to it. Monsters whose conversational abilities made their predatory nature more rather than less disturbing. Warriors who had faced Death Eaters and dark creatures without flinching found themselves paralyzed by encounters with spiders who discussed their feeding preferences while positioning themselves for optimal access to vulnerable body parts. The aftermath of the battle revealed the extent to which Acromantula participation had complicated casualty recovery efforts, with many bodies never found due to efficient consumption by creatures who left no waste and whose digestive processes eliminated even bones and clothing. The psychological impact on survivors who had witnessed spider-feeding behavior created trauma that was different in quality from normal combat stress, for they had seen intelligence applied to systematic cruelty in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between cognitive ability and moral development. The venom that Acromantulas produce represents one of the most valuable and dangerous substances in the magical world, with properties that make it essential for advanced potion brewing, while being nearly impossible to obtain safely due to the creature's intelligence and aggressive territorial behavior. Professional venom collectors who attempt to harvest Acromantula secretions must employ strategies that account for the spider's ability to recognize and remember individual humans, plan coordinated responses to intrusion attempts, and modify their behavior based on analysis of previous collection efforts. The black market trade in Acromantula venom creates economic incentives for dangerous expeditions into spider territory that often result in the disappearance of entire professional teams whose equipment and expertise prove inadequate against creatures who can analyze their techniques and develop countermeasures faster than humans can adapt their approaches. The high prices that venom commands reflect not just its magical properties but the extreme mortality rates among those who attempt to obtain it through direct confrontation with creatures who treat such attempts as elaborate forms of prey delivery. The silk that Acromantulas produce for their web networks possesses magical properties that make it valuable for creating textiles with enhanced durability and spell resistance, But harvesting this material requires entering active hunting grounds, where every strand serves as an alarm system that alerts the entire colony to the presence of potential prey. The spider's ability to distinguish between accidental contact and deliberate harvesting attempts means that even minimal silk collection requires complex deception strategies that must account for acromantular intelligence while avoiding direct confrontation with creatures whose defensive responses include coordinated pack attacks. The expansion of acromantula territory following Aragog's death created ecological disruption that affected magical creature populations throughout the British Isles, with spider colonies establishing secondary nests in locations that provided access to new hunting grounds while maintaining communication networks that linked them to the primary forbidden forest population. These expansion efforts displaced or eliminated numerous other magical species whose presence had previously maintained ecological balance in ways that human magical naturalists were only beginning to understand when the disruption made such understanding academic rather than practical. The intelligence networks that acromantulas maintain extend beyond simple colony coordination to encompass information gathering about human activities that might affect their territories or threaten their continued expansion, with individual spiders capable of conducting surveillance operations that rival those performed by trained human agents. These reconnaissance activities provide colony leadership with detailed knowledge about magical law enforcement capabilities, civilian population distributions, and defensive preparations that allow them to time their territorial expansion to minimize resistance while maximizing hunting opportunities. The philosophical implications of acromantula intelligence force uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness and moral responsibility, for these creatures demonstrate reasoning abilities that would be considered evidence of personhood in any other context, while applying those abilities exclusively to activities that involve systematic predation upon beings they are capable of recognizing as sentient individuals. Their existence challenges assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and ethics, while providing evidence that cognitive sophistication can serve evil purposes as efficiently as noble ones. The communication abilities that allow acromantulas to engage in complex conversations with humans serve primarily as hunting tools that enable them to manipulate potential prey through psychological rather than physical means, with spiders demonstrating understanding of human emotional responses that they exploit to create false sense of security or to intensify terror depending on their immediate objectives. Their mastery of human language represents learned behavior rather than innate empathy, skill acquired through observation and practice, rather than genuine desire for interspecies understanding or cooperation. The colony structures that acromantulas create within their territories reflect organizational principles that combine insect-like efficiency with mammalian social complexity, resulting in communities that function according to hierarchies based on hunting success, strategic intelligence, and reproductive capacity, while maintaining cooperative relationships that serve collective interests rather than individual advancement. These social systems enable coordinated activities on scales that would be impossible for creatures operating purely through instinctive behaviors, while creating redundancy and adaptability that makes acromantula colonies extremely resistant to disruption or elimination. The legacy of Hagrid's protection of Aragog serves as cautionary tale about the dangers of applying human emotional frameworks to creatures whose fundamental nature operates according to completely different principles, demonstrating that compassion without understanding can create situations where well-intentioned actions result in consequences far more dangerous than the problems they were meant to solve. The spider colony that grew from his misplaced kindness became a threat to every human in magical Britain, proof that some creatures cannot be reformed, domesticated, or reasoned with regardless of the intelligence they display or the apparent gratitude they express. In the deepest shadows of the forbidden forest, where moonlight cannot penetrate the canopy of webs that stretch between ancient trees like silver nets designed to catch more than simple prey, the descendants of Aragog continue their patient hunting while planning expansion into territories that will bring them into contact with human populations who remain largely unaware of the sophisticated predators whose intelligence makes them infinitely more dangerous than any mindless beast could ever be. They are reminders that consciousness without conscience creates monsters whose capabilities exceed those of creatures driven purely by instinct. Living proof that intelligence serves the purposes of its possessor, rather than automatically leading toward wisdom, cooperation, or moral development. In the most remote mountain ranges where mist clings to jagged peaks like the memories of ancient sorrows, there exist beings whose very footsteps can reshape landscapes, while their tears carry the weight of civilizations that have risen and fallen beyond the reach of recorded history. Giants, those towering embodiments of power wedded to tragedy, represent perhaps the most heartbreaking example of how intelligence combined with overwhelming physical capability can become curse rather than blessing when society offers no place for those who are too large for the world that's smaller. Beings have built around themselves. Tonight, as you rest in spaces designed for human comfort and safety, let us venture into the territories where these magnificent creatures struggle with existence that makes every interaction a potential catastrophe and every emotion a force of nature that can destroy everything they attempt to protect or cherish. The decline of giant civilization began long before the rise of modern magical governance, rooted in fundamental incompatibilities between creatures whose casual movements could level buildings, and a world increasingly organized around structures and systems designed for beings a fraction of their size. What historians euphemistically describe as territorial conflicts were, in reality, desperate struggles by giants to find spaces where they could exist without causing unintentional destruction, while wizarding communities sought to establish settlements in areas that giants had occupied for millennia without understanding that their presence made coexistence impossible on practical rather than merely political grounds. The psychological burden of existence at giant scale creates forms of isolation and frustration that smaller beings cannot truly comprehend. For these creatures possess intelligence and emotional complexity equal to any human while being trapped in bodies, whose every action carries consequences that make normal social interaction impossible to sustain. A giant's expression of affection can crush the object of their care. Their gestures of greeting can knock down walls. Their attempts at delicate manipulation can destroy whatever they are trying to help or repair, creating lives defined by constant vigilance against their own strength and perpetual loneliness born from fear of harming those they wish to befriend. Grawp, Hagrid's half-brother, exemplified both the potential and the impossibility of giant integration into wizarding society, his smaller size making him manageable enough to be brought to Hogwarts while his giant heritage ensured that he remained fundamentally incompatible with environments designed for human occupation. His attempts at gentleness, while genuinely well-intentioned, resulted in property damage and personal injury that demonstrated how even diminished giant strength could overwhelm magical protections and defensive spells through sheer physical force, applied without malicious intent, but with inevitably devastating results. The education efforts that Hagrid attempted with Grawp revealed the tragic futility of trying to civilize beings whose nature was not savage but simply incompatible with civilization as wizards understood it. For giants possessed moral sensibilities and emotional needs that aligned with human values while being housed in bodies that made acting on those values safely impossible. Grawp's progress in learning language and social customs was real and meaningful, But each achievement was overshadowed by the reality that his continued presence represented an ongoing threat to everyone around him, regardless of his intentions or his growing understanding of appropriate behavior. The giant tribal structures that developed in mountain strongholds reflected attempts to create societies where beings of such size and power could coexist peacefully. But these communities were plagued by leadership struggles that turned philosophical disagreements into physical conflicts, capable of reshaping entire valleys through the collateral damage of personal disputes. Giants fighting among themselves created destruction that rivaled natural disasters, with individual combat generating avalanches, landslides, and seismic disturbances that affected regions far beyond the immediate battle sites, while eliminating resources and territory that surviving populations required for continued existence. The psychology of giant leadership operated according to principles where personal dominance was established through demonstrations of superior destructive capability, creating political systems that rewarded violence while punishing the kinds of cooperative behavior that might have allowed giant society to develop sustainable relationships with neighboring magical communities. Chiefs who rose to power through conquest and intimidation inevitably governed through methods that emphasized strength over wisdom, ensuring that giant politics remained locked in cycles of conflict that depleted their numbers while providing no long-term solutions to the fundamental challenges of their existence. Voldemort's recruitment of giants exploited their desperation and isolation by offering them something that decades of diplomatic outreach had failed to provide: acceptance of their nature as it actually existed, rather than as other magical beings wished it could be modified or contained. His promises of territories where they could live without restraint and enemies they could destroy without moral consequence appealed to creatures whose entire existence had been defined by the impossibility of expressing their natural capabilities without causing harm to beings they did not wish to hurt. The tactical advantages that giants provided to dark forces went beyond simple physical strength to encompass psychological warfare that could break enemy morale through demonstration of forces too overwhelming for conventional magical defenses to contain or counter effectively. Villages that found themselves facing giant attacks experienced not just physical destruction but complete collapse of social cohesion, as residents realized that their protective spells, defensive positions, and evacuation plans were all meaningless against enemies whose casual movements could eliminate entire buildings, while their deliberate attacks could level fortifications that had withstood centuries of more conventional warfare. The diplomatic mission that Dumbledore organized, sending Hagrid and Madame Maxime to negotiate with giant tribes, represented one of the most dangerous assignments in Order of the Phoenix operations, requiring ambassadors to venture into territories where their physical safety depended entirely on the goodwill of creatures whose emotional responses could manifest as lethal violence, even when their intentions remained fundamentally peaceful. The envoys had to navigate political situations where a poorly chosen word or misunderstood gesture could trigger responses that would be instantly fatal, while attempting to build trust with beings whose previous experiences with wizard diplomacy had consistently resulted in betrayal and manipulation. The challenges that the diplomatic team faced went beyond language barriers and cultural differences to encompass fundamental incompatibilities between giant and human approaches to conflict resolution. For creatures whose disputes were typically settled through physical dominance, displays had difficulty understanding negotiation processes that depended on abstract concepts like mutual benefit and long-term cooperation. Giants who had spent centuries watching their populations decline through warfare and territorial loss had little reason to trust promises from wizards whose previous interventions had consistently favored human interests over giant clemina. Survival. The internal conflicts within giant communities that the ambassadors encountered revealed the extent to which external pressure had fractured traditional social structures, creating factions that disagreed not just on tactical questions about alliance with wizards, but on fundamental issues of whether their species had any future worth preserving through compromise and accommodation. Some giants advocated for complete isolation from wizard society regardless of the costs, while others supported integration attempts despite their historically poor outcomes, and still others embraced Voldemort's offers of destructive partnership as the only remaining path to dignity and purpose. The violence that characterized giant succession disputes stemmed from leadership systems that had evolved in eras when their populations were large enough to sustain regular casualties from internal conflict, but which became unsustainable when applied to communities that could not afford to lose any members to political disagreements. Chiefs who might once have ruled effectively over thousands found themselves governing handfuls of survivors while employing methods that had been designed for managing much larger and more stable populations, creating governmental approaches that were simultaneously inadequate and destructive. The magical abilities that giants possessed beyond their obvious physical advantages included resistances to spells that would incapacitate smaller beings, natural armor that turned aside curses designed to penetrate normal defenses, and strength that allowed them to function effectively, even when subjected to magical attacks that would leave other creatures completely helpless. These defensive capabilities made giants nearly impossible to subdue through conventional magical means, while their offensive potential allowed them to overwhelm most protective spells through simple application of force that exceeded the parameters for which such defenses had been designed. The territories that giants controlled in remote mountain regions represented some of the most dangerous environments in the magical world, not because of hostile magical creatures or cursed landscapes, but because the giants themselves had inadvertently created conditions where normal magical transportation failed, communication spells were disrupted, and rescue operations became impossible due to terrain that had been reshaped by centuries of giant habitation. These areas became effectively inaccessible to wizards who lacked specialized equipment and extensive preparation for dealing with environments where every landmark might shift without warning due to giant construction projects or territorial modifications. The economic impact of giant territorial claims extended far beyond the immediate areas they occupied, for their presence made entire regions unsuitable for magical development, while their movements could disrupt transportation routes and communication networks that wizarding communities depended upon for commerce and coordination. Mining operations, agricultural projects, and infrastructure development all became impossible in areas where giants might wander, creating economic exclusion zones that reduced the available territory for wizarding expansion, while providing no corresponding benefits to the magical community as a whole. The children that resulted from relationships between giants and smaller magical beings inherited tragic combinations of size, strength, and intelligence that made them unwelcome in both communities, while providing them with capabilities that were simultaneously impressive and dangerous. These half-giants like Hagrid faced lifelong challenges in controlling strength that could accidentally harm friends while dealing with social rejection from both sides of their heritage, creating individuals whose loyalty and dedication were often exceptional, but whose integration into normal society remained permanently problematic. The magical research conducted on giant physiology and capabilities revealed biological systems that operated according to principles that challenged conventional understanding of how magic and physical form interacted. for giants appeared to possess magical cores that were proportionally larger than those found in smaller beings, while being distributed throughout their bodies in ways that made them resistant to targeted magical attacks. Their blood, bone, and tissue all contained magical properties that made them valuable for potion ingredients and spell components. But harvesting such materials required dealing with living beings whose cooperation was essential and whose retaliation for betrayal would be immediate and overwhelming. The folklore that developed around giants in wizard communities reflected both genuine respect for their capabilities and deep-seated fears about their potential for destruction, creating cultural narratives that portrayed them as simultaneously noble and terrifying, wise and brutish, protective and threatening. These contradictory stereotypes made productive communication between species more difficult by creating expectations and assumptions that prevented both sides from understanding the actual motivations and needs that drove the other's behavior. The extinction pressures that giants faced included not just external conflicts with wizarding populations, but internal demographics that made sustainable reproduction increasingly difficult. As their numbers declined and potential mates became separated by distances too great for individuals to travel safely, the social structures necessary for successful giant courtship and child-rearing required community sizes that no longer existed in most regions, creating situations where isolated individuals might live entire lifetimes without encountering potential partners while their species moved inexorably toward complete disappearance. The environmental changes that accompanied the expansion of wizarding civilization into previously giant territories included modifications to magical field strengths and energy flow patterns that made traditional giant habitats less suitable for their continued occupation, while providing no alternative locations that could support their specific needs for space, resources, and isolation from smaller beings whose presence complicated their daily existence. The psychological profiles of giants who chose to work with Voldemort revealed individuals whose moral frameworks had been shaped by decades of rejection and marginalization, creating personalities that combined genuine intelligence and emotional depth with hatred and resentment that made them willing to embrace destructive roles that their better natures might otherwise have rejected. These giants were not inherently evil, but had been driven to evil choices by circumstances that offered them no alternative paths to dignity, purpose, or simple survival in a world that had no place for beings of their nature. The combat effectiveness that giants demonstrated when deployed in magical warfare exceeded most tactical predictions, not just because of their obvious physical advantages, but because their intelligence allowed them to adapt quickly to battlefield conditions, while their psychological impact on enemy forces created opportunities that more conventional troops could not exploit. Giants who learned to coordinate with wizard allies became force multipliers that could alter the outcome of entire campaigns through their presence, while those who fought independently created chaos that both sides found difficult to predict or counter. The aftermath of giant participation in the Wizarding War left survivors who were psychologically scarred by experiences that had forced them to embrace aspects of their nature that they had spent lifetimes trying to suppress or control, creating individuals who had discovered their capacity for destruction while being unable to return to previous attempts at peaceful coexistence with smaller beings. These giants carried memories of successful violence that made future restraint more difficult, while possessing knowledge about wizard vulnerabilities that made them permanently dangerous even if their intentions remained peaceful. The future of giant civilization appears to depend on developments in magical theory and social organization that could create new possibilities for coexistence between beings whose nature requires vast amounts of space and resources, and communities whose expansion continues to reduce the availability of such territories. without fundamental changes in how magical society approaches the challenge of accommodating creatures whose basic needs conflict with wizard development patterns. Giants seem destined for extinction not through dramatic conflicts, but through gradual elimination of the conditions necessary for their continued survival. In the highest peaks where snow never melts, and winds carry voices that speak of sorrows too vast for smaller beings to comprehend, the last giants continue their ancient existence while watching their world shrink around them with each passing season. They are living reminders that size and strength without corresponding social support systems become curses rather than blessings, that intelligence and emotion housed in forms too large for their environment create suffering that transcends individual tragedy to encompass the loss of entire ways of being that the world cannot afford to lose but cannot figure out how to preserve. Their footsteps echo through mountain valleys like the heartbeats of dying gods, marking time until the last of their kind finds peace in whatever realm awaits those who were too magnificent for the world they were born into. In the shadowed hours when moonlight transforms from gentle illumination into harbinger of unspeakable transformation, there exists a curse that strips away every comfortable assumption about the boundary between human consciousness and animal instinct. Lycanthropy, that most terrible of magical afflictions, creates beings who must endure monthly death of everything they consider themselves to be, only to awaken in human form with memories of violence that their civilized minds cannot fully process or accept. Tonight, as you rest safely in spaces where locked doors and protective walls can shield you from external threats, let us explore the tragedy of those who carry their greatest danger within themselves, who must fear not external predators, but the beast that shares their own heartbeat and waits with patient hunger for the moon to grant it dominance over flesh that was once purely human. The transformation process that defines lycanthropic existence operates through mechanisms that transcend simple physical change to encompass complete reorganization of consciousness, personality, and moral framework within the span of minutes that feel like hours to those experiencing them. The initial symptoms begin with heightened senses that make normal environments overwhelming, as enhanced hearing picks up conversations from neighboring buildings while improved smell reveals layers of information about every person who has passed through nearby areas within the previous days, creating sensory overload that signals the approaching dissolution of human identity. As the full moon reaches its zenith, the physical changes commence with bone structure modifications that proceed through systematic breaking and reformation of the skeletal system, each fracture accompanied by pain that exceeds normal human capacity for suffering, while being endured by minds that remain conscious and aware throughout the entire process. The lengthening of facial bones to accommodate enlarged teeth and enhanced jaw muscles creates agony that radiates through every nerve pathway, while hands reshape themselves into claws capable of rending flesh with efficiency that no human weaponry could match. The psychological transformation that accompanies physical change represents perhaps the most terrifying aspect of lycanthropy, for the human consciousness does not simply disappear, but becomes trapped within a mind that operates according to predatory instincts that recognize no moral boundaries or emotional attachments that might interfere with the hunt. The werewolf retains access to human memories and intelligence, while viewing them through perspectives that evaluate every relationship and experience solely in terms of hunting opportunities and territorial advantages. Remus Lupin's monthly ordeal exemplified both the nobility possible within lycanthropic existence and the enormous costs that such nobility required, for his determination to maintain his humanity during transformation led him to develop elaborate rituals of isolation and restraint that protected others, while subjecting himself to psychological torture that accumulated over decades into trauma that no magical healing could fully address. His consumption of wolfsbane potion represented a delicate balance between chemical suppression of lycanthropic instincts and preservation of enough human consciousness to prevent the complete personality dissolution that made other werewolves dangerous to everyone around them. The brewing of wolfsbane potion requires precision that approaches the limits of what even master apothecaries can achieve consistently, with preparation processes that must be timed to coincide with specific lunar phases, while incorporating ingredients whose magical properties fluctuate according to seasonal cycles and celestial alignments. A single error in measurement, timing, or stirring technique can result in batches that not only fail to provide protection, but actively enhance the werewolf's predatory capabilities, while eliminating the restraints that normally prevent lycanthropes from remembering their transformed activities with perfect clarity. The social isolation that lycanthropy imposes extends far beyond the obvious dangers of monthly transformation to encompass year-round discrimination that makes normal employment impossible, romantic relationships unsustainable, and casual friendships dangerous for both parties involved. Werewolves must constantly evaluate whether their condition poses threats to people they care about while dealing with rejection from communities that view them as monsters regardless of their behavior during human phases, creating lives defined by loneliness that is both self-imposed and socially enforced. Fenrir Greyback represented the darkest possible expression of lycanthropic nature, embracing the predatory aspects of his condition, while rejecting every attempt at maintaining human moral frameworks or emotional connections that might limit his capacity for causing suffering. His deliberate targeting of children revealed strategic thinking that went beyond simple feeding to encompass psychological warfare against families and communities, understanding that the transformation of innocence created trauma that extended far beyond individual victims to affect entire social networks. The infection process that Greyback employed combined physical assault with psychological manipulation, ensuring that his victims understood exactly what was happening to them, while being powerless to prevent the contamination that would reshape their entire existence according to his sadistic preferences. His bites were precisely calibrated to transmit lycanthropy while avoiding immediately fatal damage, creating survivors who would spend the rest of their lives reliving the moment when their humanity was stolen along with their blood and flesh. The pack mentality that develops among werewolves who embrace their condition creates social structures that combine human intelligence with predatory efficiency, resulting in groups that can plan coordinated attacks while maintaining the kind of loyalty and cooperation that makes them far more dangerous than individual lycanthropes operating alone. These packs develop territories that they defend with violence that exceeds even normal werewolf aggression, treating any intrusion as existential threat that must be eliminated through methods that ensure no survivors remain to report their locations or activities. The recruitment strategies that Greyback employed to build his pack involved identifying individuals whose psychological profiles suggested they would adapt well to lycanthropic existence, targeting people who already harbored resentments against mainstream magical society or whose personal circumstances made them vulnerable to offers of belonging and purpose that came at costs they did not initially understand. His ability to recognize potential followers demonstrated understanding of human psychology that he applied with predatory precision to build organizations devoted to spreading lycanthropy as widely and destructively as possible. The transformation of children into werewolves creates particularly tragic situations, as young lycanthropes lack the psychological resources necessary to understand or cope with their condition, while possessing physical capabilities that make them dangerous to family members and friends who might otherwise provide emotional support during their adjustment periods. These child werewolves often experience their first transformations as complete breaks from reality, awakening to find evidence of violence that their conscious minds cannot reconcile with their self-image or moral beliefs. The educational challenges faced by lycanthropic children make normal schooling impossible, as their enhanced senses and periodic absences create situations that expose their condition to classmates and teachers, while their potential for accidental injury during partial transformations makes them liability risks that most institutions cannot accept. Specialized educational programs for lycanthropic youth require resources and expertise that few magical communities possess, while serving populations too small to justify the enormous costs and risks involved in their operation. The underground networks that develop to support lycanthropic communities operate outside normal magical law enforcement oversight by necessity, creating parallel societies that provide services and resources that mainstream institutions refuse to offer, while being vulnerable to infiltration and exploitation by individuals like Greyback, who use these support systems to identify, target potential victims or recruits. The medical research conducted on lycanthropy reveals magical mechanisms that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical form, suggesting that the curse operates through modification of magical field patterns that normally maintain the boundary between human and animal magical signatures. These field disruptions create cascade effects that influence not just physical transformation but personality, memory, and emotional responses in ways that make lycanthropy as much psychological condition as physical curse. The economic impact of lycanthropy on affected individuals and their families extends beyond obvious employment difficulties to encompass medical costs, security expenses, and social services that must be provided outside normal magical healthcare systems due to discrimination and legal restrictions that prevent lycanthropes from accessing conventional treatment options. These hidden costs create financial burdens that often force lycanthropic families into poverty while making their condition more difficult to manage safely. The legal framework surrounding lycanthropic rights reflects societal ambivalence about whether werewolves should be treated as cursed humans, deserving of protection and accommodation, or as dangerous creatures requiring containment, control, creating inconsistent policies that provide neither adequate protection for lycanthropes nor sufficient security for the communities they potentially threaten. These legal uncertainties make it difficult for werewolves to plan their lives while creating opportunities for exploitation by those who understand how to manipulate unclear regulations. The seasonal variations in lycanthropic behavior correspond not just to lunar cycles, but to longer patterns related to magical field fluctuations that influence the intensity and duration of transformations, with some periods of the year creating conditions where werewolves retain more human consciousness during transformation, while others produce changes that are more complete and potentially permanent. These variations make long-term planning impossible while creating unpredictable risks that affect not just lycanthropes but everyone in their vicinity. The relationship between lycanthropy and other magical conditions creates complex interactions that can either mitigate or intensify the curse's effects, with some magical abilities providing partial resistance to transformation, while others enhance lycanthropic capabilities in ways that make affected individuals more dangerous during both human and wolf phases. These interactions are poorly understood and rarely studied due to the ethical difficulties involved in researching conditions that affect so few individuals while posing such significant risks to researchers. The psychological profiles of lycanthropes who successfully integrate into magical society reveal common characteristics that include exceptional self-discipline, highly developed empathy, and sophisticated understanding of risk management, suggesting that successful adaptation to lycanthropy requires personality traits that are relatively rare in the general population. These individuals often become valuable contributors to their communities, specifically because their condition has forced them to develop capabilities and perspectives that normal life experiences do not provide. The treatment approaches that show promise for helping lycanthropes manage their condition extend beyond wolfsbane potion to encompass psychological counseling, magical meditation techniques, and environmental modifications that can reduce transformation trauma while improving the chances of maintaining human consciousness during wolf phases. These holistic approaches require resources and expertise that few practitioners possess while serving populations that cannot afford conventional treatment costs. The research into lycanthropy prevention focuses on identifying the magical mechanisms that allow the curse to be transmitted through physical contact, while developing countermeasures that could protect potential victims without requiring them to avoid all contact with lycanthropes during vulnerable periods. These prevention efforts must balance effectiveness with practicality while avoiding approaches that would increase discrimination against lycanthropes who pose no threat during their human phases. The rehabilitation programs designed for lycanthropes who have engaged in violent behavior during transformations attempt to address both the practical challenges of preventing future incidents and the psychological trauma that results from memories of actions taken while under the curse's influence. These programs require specialized facilities and staff trained to work with individuals whose condition creates unique therapeutic challenges while posing ongoing safety risks. The family dynamics that develop around lycanthropic members reflect the constant tension between love and fear that characterizes relationships where one person's condition creates ongoing danger for everyone else involved, requiring adaptation strategies that can maintain emotional connections while implementing security measures that protect all family members from potential harm. These adaptations often create household routines and social patterns that isolate the entire family from normal community participation. The career limitations that lycanthropy imposes extend beyond jobs that require physical presence during full moon periods to encompass any position where the potential for transformation could create liability issues, effectively excluding lycanthropes from most forms of employment, while creating economic pressures that can push them toward illegal activities or dependence on underground support networks that may have connections to criminal pressures. Organizations. The advocacy efforts organized by lycanthropic communities focus on changing social attitudes and legal frameworks that perpetuate discrimination while promoting research into better treatment options and prevention strategies. But these efforts face opposition from groups that view any accommodation of lycanthropes as unacceptable risk to public safety, regardless of the actual statistical evidence about lycanthropic violence rates. The international variations in lycanthropic law and social acceptance create situations where werewolves may need to relocate to find communities that can accommodate their needs, but these relocations often require abandoning family connections and career opportunities, while adapting to different cultural approaches to lycanthropic management that may be more or less effective than familiar methods. The aging process in lycanthropes appears to be influenced by the accumulated physical and psychological stress of repeated transformations, with many werewolves showing signs of premature aging and increased susceptibility to magical and mundane health problems that may be related to the energy expenditure required for monthly shape changing or the psychological trauma associated with maintaining dual identities over extended periods. In the quiet hours before dawn, when transformation subsides and human consciousness returns to bodies that carry scars and memories of violence that civilized minds struggle to process, lycanthropes face the daily challenge of reconciling their essential humanity with knowledge of what they become when reason fails and instinct takes control. They are living reminders that the most dangerous monsters are often those that wear familiar faces, that evil can emerge from good people placed in impossible circumstances, and that the thin line between civilization and savagery runs not between different species, but through the heart of every consciousness that has ever struggled with desires that society cannot safely accommodate. In the deepest shadows of the forbidden forest, where ancient trees stand sentinel over secrets that daylight dare not illuminate, there dwell creatures whose very existence serves as bridge between the world of the living and the realm that lies beyond the final breath. Thestrals, those skeletal harbingers draped in midnight wings and crowned with eyes that reflect the wisdom of witnessing countless endings, can be perceived only by those who have looked upon death and truly understood its meaning. Tonight, as you rest in the safety of spaces where mortality seems distant and abstract, let us venture into the territory of these magnificent beings who serve as both transport and testament to the truth that some experiences change us so fundamentally that we can never again see the world through the same eyes that once found comfort in beautiful illusions. The invisibility that defines Thestrals for most of the magical world operates through magical mechanisms that transcend simple concealment, for these creatures exist in a state of partial displacement from normal reality that allows them to be perceived only by consciousness that has been altered through direct encounter with the absolute finality of death. This selective visibility creates a form of natural selection among observers, ensuring that only those who possess the psychological framework necessary to appreciate the Thestral's true nature can interact with them meaningfully, while protecting the creatures from casual curiosity or exploitation by individuals who lack the emotional maturity to understand what they represent. The appearance that Thestrals present to those capable of seeing them challenges every comfortable aesthetic assumption about the relationship between beauty and horror, for their skeletal frames and leathery wings speak of death and decay, while their graceful movements and intelligent eyes reveal dignity and wisdom that transcends physical form. Their heads, reminiscent of dragons, but lacking scales or fire, possess features that suggest nobility earned through suffering, while their bodies, though gaunt to the point of seeming malnourished, move with fluid precision that demonstrates perfect adaptation to their role as carriers between worlds. The feeding habits of Thestrals reveal their fundamental connection to the cycles of life and death that govern all existence, for they consume only flesh that has already died, rather than hunting living prey like conventional predators, making them scavengers in the most literal sense while serving ecological functions that maintain balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Their presence at sites where death has occurred is not coincidence but necessity, for they serve as biological processes of the magical residue that accumulates around mortality events and would otherwise create disturbances in local magical fields. The herd that inhabits the Forbidden Forest exists under Hagrid's protection, not because these creatures require domestication, but because their value to both the magical ecosystem and human transportation needs makes them targets for poachers and dark wizards who would exploit their unique capabilities without regard for the psychological damage that such exploitation inflicts on beings whose intelligence and sensitivity make them vulnerable to the same forms of emotional trauma that affect humans subjected to abuse or neglect. The flight characteristics that make Thestrals valuable for long-distance magical transportation include navigational abilities that operate through senses unavailable to living creatures, allowing them to perceive destinations across vast distances while avoiding magical barriers and detection spells that would impede conventional travel methods. Their wings, though appearing fragile due to their membrane-like construction, can carry remarkable loads through atmospheric conditions that would ground other flying creatures while maintaining speeds that exceed those achievable by most broomsticks over extended distances. The directional sense that thestrals possess operates through their connection to the magical resonance patterns created by death events, allowing them to locate specific individuals or places by following traces of mortality that linger in magical field structures long after physical evidence has disappeared. This ability makes them invaluable for missions that require reaching destinations that are hidden, warded, or otherwise protected against normal magical transportation, while their silent flight capabilities ensure that their approach will not be detected through conventional surveillance methods. The emotional intelligence that thestrals demonstrate in their interactions with humans who can see them reflects their role as psychopomps, creatures whose function involves guiding souls through transitions between different states of existence while providing comfort and understanding to those who are struggling with loss, grief, or the psychological aftermath of witnessing death. Their gentle behavior toward people who have been marked by mortality experiences suggests empathy that goes beyond simple animal sympathy to encompass genuine understanding of the emotional processes that such experiences create. Luna Lovegood's matter-of-fact relationship with thestrals exemplified the healthy psychological integration that becomes possible when individuals accept death as natural part of existence rather than treating it as tragedy, to be avoided, or trauma to be suppressed. For her ability to see and interact with these creatures reflected her unusual capacity for acknowledging reality without being destroyed by aspects of it that others might find unbearable. Her casual mentions of thestrals in conversation revealed how visibility could become simply another aspect of magical perception rather than mark of psychological damage or emotional scarring. Harry Potter's initial inability to see thestrals despite having witnessed his parents' murder as an infant, followed by their sudden visibility after Cedric Diggory's death, demonstrated that mere exposure to mortality events is insufficient to grant perception of these creatures. If the psychological processing necessary to truly understand death's significance has not occurred, his delayed recognition of thestrals reflected the protection that memory suppression and emotional numbing had provided during his early childhood, barriers that were finally overcome by an experience of loss that he was old enough and emotionally mature enough to process fully. The classroom demonstrations that Hagrid conducted with the thestral herd revealed the educational challenges involved in teaching students about creatures that most of them could not see, while those who could see them often preferred not to discuss the experiences that had granted them such visibility. These lessons created uncomfortable social dynamics where students were divided into those who could perceive reality that others could not access, and those who had to trust descriptions of phenomena that they could not verify through their own senses. The reproductive patterns of thestrals reflect their connection to death through breeding cycles that are triggered by seasonal variations in mortality rates within their territories, with mating behaviors that occur during periods when death events are most frequent, while foal development proceeds through gestational periods that are synchronized with local patterns of loss and renewal. These reproductive timing mechanisms ensure that new thestrals are born into environments where their unique capabilities will be most needed and appreciated, while their parents are emotionally and psychologically prepared to provide appropriate care. The magical properties that thestral hair and hide possess make them valuable components for advanced magical items that require materials with inherent connections to mortality and transition, including invisibility cloaks that function through death-adjacent magic rather than simple concealment spells, and transportation devices that can cross barriers between dimensions where life and death operate according to different principles. Harvesting these materials requires cooperation from the thestrals themselves, as attempts to obtain them through force or deception result in products that lack the essential magical properties, while potentially causing psychological harm to creatures whose emotional well-being affects their magical capabilities. The training process for thestrals used in transportation service involves not traditional domestication, but the development of mutual understanding and trust between creatures and riders, with successful partnerships depending on the human's ability to acknowledge and accept the thestral's nature, while demonstrating respect for the significance of experiences that allow such partnerships to form. These relationships often become deeply meaningful for both parties, providing thestrals with sense of purpose, while offering humans companionship that acknowledges, rather than ignores, the reality of their mortality experiences. The journey to the Ministry of Magic that Harry and his friends undertook while riding thestrals represented perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of their mission, as those who could not see their mounts had to overcome not just fear of flying on invisible creatures, but the deeper anxiety that comes from realizing that their friends possessed knowledge and capabilities that remained inaccessible, regardless of trust or explanation. This experience created lasting awareness of how shared trauma can simultaneously bond individuals together while separating them from those who have not undergone similar experiences. The flight itself demonstrated thestrals' ability to navigate through urban environments without being detected by muggles or magical surveillance systems. Their natural invisibility to most observers, combining with their silent flight capabilities to create transportation method that could move through heavily monitored areas without triggering alarms or attracting attention from security. Forces who would respond to more conventional, magical transportation methods. The psychological preparation that riders must undergo before attempting thestral flight includes not just acceptance of the creature's nature, but acknowledgement of their own mortality and the reality that the experience may trigger memories or emotions related to previous death encounters that could create dangerous distractions during flight. This preparation process often becomes a therapeutic experience that helps individuals process grief or trauma while building confidence in their ability to function despite the psychological burdens that visibility to thestrals represents. The landing procedures for thestral flight require coordination between mount and rider that depends on non-verbal communication and emotional attunement rather than conventional riding skills. As thestrals respond to their passengers' psychological states while adjusting their flight patterns to accommodate fear, uncertainty, or emotional distress that might compromise safety during approach and landing phases. These empathetic responses make thestrals remarkably safe transportation, despite their intimidating appearance and the psychological challenges associated with their visibility requirements. The cultural significance of thestrals in various magical communities reflects different approaches to death and mortality, with some societies viewing them as sacred creatures whose appearance signals important spiritual transitions, while others consider them omens of misfortune whose presence should be avoided or appeased through ritual offerings. These cultural variations create different management practices and legal protections for thestral populations, while influencing individual attitudes toward the creatures among wizards from different backgrounds. The conservation efforts directed toward thestral populations focus on protecting habitat areas where death occurs naturally rather than through violence or magical interference, as these creatures require environments where mortality follows natural patterns rather than traumatic events that create magical disturbances harmful to their psychological well-being. These conservation needs create unique challenges for magical naturalists, who must balance ecosystem protection with the reality that thestrals thrive in locations that other creatures and human populations prefer to avoid. The research conducted on thestral psychology and behavior must account for the fact that most investigators cannot see their subjects directly, while those who can see them often bring emotional baggage and psychological complexity that affects their objectivity and research methodology. These observational challenges make thestrals among the most poorly understood magical creatures, despite their importance to magical transportation and their role in ecosystem maintenance. The breeding programs established to maintain domestic thestral populations face difficulties related to the creature's requirement for environments where death occurs regularly enough to support their psychological needs while being controlled enough to ensure safety for human handlers and other magical creatures who share their habitat. These programs must balance the thestral's natural behavioral patterns with practical requirements for managing populations that serve important functions within magical society. The philosophical implications of thestral visibility raise questions about the nature of perception and reality that challenge comfortable assumptions about the relationship between experience and understanding. For these creatures suggest that some aspects of existence can only be perceived by consciousness that has been transformed through specific types of encounter, while remaining forever invisible to those who have not undergone such transformation. This selective perception creates epistemological questions about whether thestrals represent objective reality that some observers cannot access or subjective phenomena created by psychological states that death experiences produce. The therapeutic applications that some healers have explored involve using thestral interactions to help patients process grief and trauma related to death experiences, with the creature's empathetic nature and visible presence providing validation for psychological states that are often dismissed or minimized by individuals who have not undergone similar experiences. These therapeutic approaches remain controversial due to the risks associated with exposing traumatized individuals to creatures whose very existence reminds them of experiences they may be trying to forget or suppress. The magical theory that explains thestral invisibility suggests creatures that exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, with their physical forms anchored in normal reality, while aspects of their existence extend into realms adjacent to death, where different perceptual rules apply. This multi-dimensional existence would explain their transportation capabilities and navigational abilities, while accounting for the consciousness alterations required to perceive them fully. In the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, when the boundary between life and death becomes thin enough for even ordinary consciousness to sense its proximity, thestrals glide through forests and meadows with grace that speaks of acceptance rather than resignation, wisdom earned through witnessing rather than bitterness, accumulated through suffering. They are living reminders that death is not enemy to be defeated, but transition to be acknowledged, not tragedy to be avoided, but truth to be integrated into understanding of existence that remains incomplete without recognition of its own temporary nature. Their wings carry more than passengers between destinations, but souls between different states of awareness, offering transportation that is simultaneously physical journey and spiritual transformation for those brave enough to acknowledge what they represent and wise enough to appreciate the gifts that such acknowledgement provides. In the crystalline depths of a cavern where water holds more than mere reflections and silence carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken farewells, there lies one of the most profoundly disturbing applications of necromantic magic ever conceived by mortal minds. The Inferi, those drowned guardians whose pale forms drift beneath still waters like forgotten nightmares given substance, represent the ultimate corruption of death itself, not the gentle rest that should follow life's conclusion, but forced animation, that transforms peaceful endings into eternal servitude. Tonight, as you rest in the warmth of spaces where death remains natural and final, let us descend into that terrible cave where Voldemort created an army from the unwilling dead, turning the sanctuary of a hidden lake into a mausoleum where corpses dream only of dragging the living down to join their waterlogged ranks. The creation of Inferi requires magical processes that violate fundamental laws governing the boundary between life and death, for these creatures are not merely reanimated corpses, but specifically engineered guardians whose consciousness has been stripped away while their bodies are enhanced with capabilities that exceed those they possessed in life. The necromantic rituals necessary to produce such beings involve not just resurrection magic, but systematic removal of everything that made the original person human, leaving behind vessels that retain muscle memory and basic motor functions, while being driven by compulsions that override any remaining traces of individual will or moral consideration. The lake that served as tomb and fortress for one of Voldemort's most precious Horcruxes had been chosen not for its beauty or accessibility, but for its capacity to support the specific magical conditions that Inferi require for long-term functionality, with water temperatures, mineral content, and magical resonance patterns, all carefully calibrated to preserve the undead guardians, while preventing the decay that would normally render corpses unsuitable for animation within months of death. The cave itself amplified these preservative effects through geological formations that channeled magical energy in ways that sustained the Inferi, while creating environmental conditions hostile to most forms of life. The victims that Voldemort selected for transformation into Inferi were not random casualties, but specifically chosen individuals whose physical characteristics, magical capabilities, and psychological profiles made them suitable for conversion into aquatic guardians whose effectiveness would persist across decades of underwater existence. These choices revealed the calculating precision that characterized all of Voldemort's magical innovations, with each Inferi representing not just raw material for necromantic experimentation, but strategic asset chosen for maximum effectiveness in the specific role they would be required to fulfill. The magical binding that connected the Inferi to their protective duties operated through compulsions that went beyond simple command structures to encompass fundamental alteration of whatever consciousness remained within their reanimated forms, ensuring that their guardian functions would continue indefinitely regardless of changes in leadership, strategic priorities, or external circumstances that might affect other forms of magical security. These bindings made the Inferi simultaneously more reliable and more terrifying than living guardians, for they could not be reasoned with, bribed, or convinced to abandon their duties through any appeal to emotion, logic, or self-interest. The detection systems that the Inferi employed to identify intruders operated through sensory mechanisms that combined enhanced versions of normal human perception with entirely new capabilities that allowed them to monitor their aquatic environment with precision that exceeded anything achievable through conventional magical surveillance. Their underwater vision could distinguish between naturally occurring movements and deliberate intrusion attempts, while their hearing could track individual heartbeats through water and stone, creating awareness networks that made stealth approaches nearly impossible despite the apparent stillness of their lake environment. The attack patterns that Inferi displayed when their domain was violated revealed coordination and tactical thinking that suggested retention of higher cognitive functions despite the removal of individual personalities and moral frameworks. For these creatures moved together with precision that indicated shared strategic understanding, while adapting their approaches based on analysis of intruder capabilities and defensive responses. Their collective intelligence made them far more dangerous than individual reanimated corpses would have been, creating coordinated threat that could overwhelm opponents through superior numbers and tactical flexibility. Dumbledore's encounter with the Inferi during the Locket retrieval mission demonstrated both the headmaster's formidable magical abilities and the genuine threat that these creatures posed even to wizards of exceptional skill and experience, for his defensive responses required constant vigilance and enormous magical expenditure, while providing only temporary protection against guardians whose numbers and persistence made ultimate victory through conventional combat approaches impossible to sustain. The battle revealed that Inferi were designed not to be defeated, but to exhaust and overwhelm their opponents through attrition rather than superior individual capabilities. The fire magic that proved most effective against Inferi attacks operated through principles that went beyond simple heat generation to encompass magical flames that could disrupt the necromantic energy patterns, maintaining their animation while creating barrier effects that prevented them from coordinating their assault formations. However, even these flames required constant maintenance and enormous magical focus to remain effective, while the Inferi demonstrated ability to adapt their attack strategies to minimize exposure to fire damage while exploiting any gaps or weaknesses in flame-based defensive perimeters. The psychological impact of fighting Inferi extended beyond normal combat stress to encompass horror that came from engaging opponents who had once been living people while being forced to use methods that involved destroying what remained of their physical forms, creating moral and emotional conflicts that could paralyze combatants who retained sufficient empathy to recognize the humanity that had been stripped from their attackers. These psychological factors made Inferi particularly effective against opponents who possessed strong moral frameworks or emotional attachments that might interfere with the ruthless efficiency required for survival. The aquatic environment that Inferi preferred for their operations provided them with tactical advantages that extended far beyond simple concealment, for their enhanced underwater mobility allowed them to attack from directions that surface-dwelling opponents could not adequately defend, while their ability to remain submerged indefinitely eliminated time pressure that might otherwise favor living combatants who required air, rest, and periodic recuperation. The water itself became weapon in their hands, creating drag and resistance that hampered their opponents' movements, while enhancing their own capabilities. The preservation methods that maintained Inferi functionality over extended periods involved more than simple prevention of decay, encompassing magical processes that strengthened their physical forms beyond normal human limitations, while eliminating weaknesses that living bodies possessed, such as vulnerability to pain, fatigue, or psychological pressure that might compromise combat effectiveness. These enhancements made individual Inferi more dangerous than they had been in life, while ensuring that their capabilities would not degrade over time as normal undead creatures might be expected to do. The magical signatures that Inferi emanated created environmental effects that extended beyond their immediate presence to influence local magical fields in ways that made certain types of spells more difficult to cast, while enhancing necromantic magic and other forms of death-related sorcery. These field modifications meant that combating Inferi became progressively more challenging the longer battles continued, as the magical environment itself shifted to favor the undead guardians while hampering their opponent's ability to maintain defensive spells or coordinate counterattacks. The recruitment process that Voldemort used to obtain suitable candidates for Inferi conversion involved not just selection of appropriate victims, but careful timing of their deaths to ensure that the necromantic transformation could be completed while their bodies retained optimal magical receptivity, requiring coordination between assassination activities and ritual preparation that demonstrated the systematic nature of his approach to creating these guardians. This process meant that each inferi represented not spontaneous magical experiment, but carefully planned strategic asset. The storage and maintenance requirements for inferi armies necessitated specialized facilities that could provide appropriate environmental conditions while remaining hidden from magical law enforcement agencies, whose detection methods might identify the necromantic energy signatures that sustained large numbers of reanimated corpses. These logistical challenges limited the practical applications of inferi as military assets, while making their deployment as guardians for fixed installations much more feasible and strategically valuable. The command structures that governed inferi behavior operated through magical bonds that connected them directly to their creator's will, rather than relying on intermediate authority figures who might be compromised, corrupted, or eliminated by enemy action, ensuring that these guardians would continue functioning according to their original programming, regardless of changes in overall strategic circumstances or organizational leadership. This direct connection made them absolutely reliable, while also making them vulnerable to attacks that targeted their creator rather than the creatures themselves. The sensory capabilities that allowed inferi to function effectively in their aquatic environment included enhanced tactile perception that could detect minute changes in water pressure or temperature that indicated the presence of living beings, while their modified circulatory systems eliminated the need for breathing while maintaining sufficient blood flow to support enhanced muscular function and sensory processing. These physiological modifications represented sophisticated understanding of undead anatomy that went far beyond simple reanimation techniques. The combat effectiveness that individual inferi demonstrated reflected not just their enhanced physical capabilities, but also their complete immunity to psychological warfare, pain-based deterrence, or intimidation tactics that might influence living opponents, making them opponents who could only be defeated through methods that caused sufficient physical damage to disrupt their animation, rather than through approaches that relied on affecting their judgment, morale, or tactical, decision-making processes. The magical theory that explained inferi animation suggested necromantic techniques that operated through manipulation of life force patterns in ways that preserved motor functions and sensory capabilities while eliminating consciousness, personality, and individual will that might interfere with their guardian duties. This selective preservation of capabilities while eliminating human qualities represented sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and physical function that pushed the boundaries of what necromantic magic could achieve. The environmental impact of maintaining large numbers of inferi in aquatic environments created ecological disruption that extended beyond their immediate habitat to affect entire underground water systems, with necromantic energy leaching into groundwater supplies, while the presence of so many undead creatures altered local magical field patterns in ways that influenced plant and animal life across wide geographical areas. These environmental effects made inferi installations detectable through careful analysis, while creating long-term consequences that persisted long after the creatures themselves were destroyed. The vulnerability that fire represented to inferi operations stemmed from more than simple physical weakness, encompassing disruption of the magical energy patterns that maintained their animation, while creating psychological associations that triggered primitive fear responses embedded in whatever consciousness remained within their reanimated forms. However, exploiting this vulnerability required sustained magical effort that few wizards could maintain under combat conditions while facing opponents whose numbers and persistence made extended battles nearly inevitable. The intelligence-gathering capabilities that Inferi possessed through their enhanced senses and networked awareness allowed them to accumulate detailed information about intruders' capabilities, tactical approaches, and psychological weaknesses that could be used to improve defensive responses during subsequent encounters, making them progressively more effective guardians as they gained experience through actual combat situations rather than merely following predetermined behavioral patterns. The ethical implications of Inferi creation forced uncomfortable questions about the nature of death, consciousness, and individual identity within magical society, for these creatures represented systematic violation of fundamental principles regarding respect for the deceased while demonstrating capabilities that made them valuable military and security assets despite their morally problematic origins. These ethical conflicts made legal frameworks regarding necromantic magic difficult to establish and enforce consistently. The disposal methods required for eliminated Inferi had to account for the lingering necromantic contamination that their bodies retained even after animation ceased, necessitating specialized destruction techniques that could neutralize magical residue while preventing environmental contamination that might create conditions suitable for spontaneous reanimation or other forms of undead manifestation in locations where destroyed Inferi remains were buried or disposed of improperly. The psychological profiles of wizards capable of creating and controlling Inferi revealed individuals whose relationship with death and human dignity had been so fundamentally corrupted that they could view former people as raw materials for magical experimentation without experiencing normal emotional responses that would prevent such activities, suggesting personality disorders that went far beyond simple moral flexibility to encompass complete disconnection from empathetic responses that characterized healthy psychological development. The strategic applications of Inferi as guardians reflected their optimal deployment in situations where absolute reliability was more important than tactical flexibility, making them ideal for protecting fixed assets that required long-term security while being less suitable for operations that demanded rapid adaptation to changing circumstances or complex decision-making capabilities that their limited consciousness could not support effectively. In the depths of that cursed lake, where pale forms continue their eternal patrol beneath waters that have never known sunlight's warmth, the Inferi drift through their liquid cemetery with purpose that death could not diminish and conscience that life could not restore. They are reminders that even the grave offers no sanctuary when evil possesses sufficient power and moral corruption to reach beyond death itself, that the peace which should follow life's conclusion can be stolen just as surely as life itself, and that some violations of natural law create consequences that persist long after their perpetrators have been defeated or destroyed. Their waterlogged faces, forever turned upward toward a surface they can never breach, serve as testimony to the truth that death without dignity becomes slavery without end, and that the ultimate victory of evil lies not in destroying life but in corrupting death itself into instrument of eternal suffering. In the darkest corners where shadows pool like liquid fear, and light becomes stranger to spaces that have never known warmth, there exist creatures whose very essence is defined not by what they are, but by what they become when observed by minds unprepared for the confrontation with their own deepest terrors. Boggarts, those shape-shifting embodiments of psychological vulnerability, represent perhaps the most insidious form of magical predation ever catalogued, for they feed not on flesh or blood, but on the raw emotional energy that fear generates when perfectly calibrated to exploit the specific weaknesses that each individual mind harbors in its most protected depths. Tonight, as you rest surrounded by familiar comforts that speak of safety and predictability, let us venture into territories where reality itself becomes weapon in the hands of creatures whose existence depends entirely on their ability to transform your most private nightmares into physical manifestations that can pursue you through waking hours with relentless dedication to psychological destruction. The fundamental nature of boggart existence operates through magical mechanisms that transcend simple shape-shifting to encompass forms of telepathic intrusion that can penetrate even the most carefully constructed mental defenses, reading not just conscious fears but deep psychological structures that their victims may not even recognize within themselves. These creatures possess no fixed form of their own, but exist as pure potential, magical energy that remains formless until it encounters conscious minds whose fear patterns provide the templates necessary for physical manifestation that can interact with normal reality while retaining connection to the psychological realm from which their power derives. The feeding process that sustains boggarts involves more than simple terror consumption, encompassing complex magical transformations that convert emotional energy into forms that these creatures can metabolize, while simultaneously reinforcing the very fear responses that provide their sustenance, creating feedback loops that make encounters with boggarts progressively more terrifying. As victims' initial fright provides fuel for increasingly sophisticated psychological attacks, calibrated to maximize emotional distress through perfect understanding of individual vulnerability, patterns. The shape-shifting capabilities that define boggart encounters represent magical artistry of the most malevolent kind, with transformations that capture not just visual appearance but behavior patterns, speech characteristics, and even magical abilities that allow them to perfectly impersonate whatever their victim fears most, while adding elements of unpredictability that prevent adaptation or psychological preparation for subsequent encounters. These transformations are not mere illusions but temporary reality, alterations that grant boggarts access to whatever capabilities their assumed forms possess, making them genuinely dangerous rather than simply frightening. The psychological hunting methods that boggarts employ demonstrate intelligence that goes far beyond simple predatory instinct to encompass sophisticated understanding of human consciousness and the complex relationships between memory, trauma, and emotional response that allow them to identify and exploit weaknesses that their victims may have spent lifetimes learning to suppress or manage. Their ability to surface repressed memories, childhood fears, and unprocessed trauma creates encounters that function as involuntary therapy sessions conducted by malevolent entities whose only interest lies in maximizing psychological damage. The Professor Lupin's classroom demonstration of boggart behavior provided students with controlled exposure to these creatures while revealing the extent to which individual fears could vary dramatically, even among people sharing similar backgrounds, experiences, and cultural influences, with each student's boggart taking forms that reflected not just obvious phobias but deep-seated anxieties about failure, rejection, loss of control, or confrontation with aspects of themselves that they preferred to keep hidden from public view and sometimes from conscious awareness. The ridiculous charm that serves as primary defense against boggart attacks operates through magical principles that involve deliberate inversion of fear responses, forcing laughter in situations where terror would normally be the appropriate emotional reaction, while simultaneously disrupting the psychological feedback loops that provide boggarts with the energy they require to maintain their manifestations. However, this defensive spell requires not just magical skill, but genuine psychological courage to find humor in confrontation with one's deepest fears while under stress that most people find overwhelming. The nesting behaviors that boggarts display when establishing territory in dark spaces reveal preferences for locations that combine physical darkness with psychological significance, choosing hiding places that carry emotional weight for potential victims, while providing environmental conditions that enhance their shape-shifting capabilities and make discovery less likely. These preferred habitats include abandoned buildings where traumatic events occurred, storage areas containing objects associated with loss or grief, and spaces that remind observers of childhood fears or adult anxieties about mortality and failure. The multiplication process that allows boggart populations to expand in favorable environments operates through magical reproduction that differs fundamentally from biological breeding, with successful feeding episodes creating magical surplus that can spontaneously generate new boggarts, while established creatures can also create offspring through deliberate division of their essential magical essence. This reproductive mechanism means that areas that experience boggart infestations can quickly become overwhelmed with creatures whose numbers exceed local food supplies, leading to increasingly desperate and aggressive hunting behaviors. Mrs. Weasley's encounter with the boggart in the drawing room at Grimmauld Place demonstrated how these creatures could exploit fears that went beyond personal safety to encompass terror about harm befalling loved ones, with her boggart cycling through images of her family members' corpses in ways that suggested not random selection, but systematic exploration of her deepest maternal anxieties, designed to identify which specific loss scenarios would generate the maximum emotional trauma. This encounter revealed that boggarts could maintain extended transformations while conducting psychological experiments on their victims. The resistance that some individuals demonstrate to boggart effects appears to correlate with psychological factors that include self-awareness, emotional processing skills, and experience with genuine trauma that has been successfully integrated rather than suppressed, suggesting that boggarts are most effective against victims who avoid confronting their fears rather than those who have learned to acknowledge and manage anxiety through healthy coping mechanisms. This resistance pattern indicates that boggart vulnerability is not fixed characteristic, but can be reduced through personal development and therapeutic work. The professional boggart removal services that operate within magical communities require specialists whose training encompasses not just magical combat techniques, but psychological preparation that allows them to maintain effectiveness when confronting creatures whose attacks are specifically designed to exploit their individual weaknesses and professional fears. These specialists must develop ability to function while experiencing terror responses that would incapacitate normal individuals while maintaining enough emotional control to cast defensive spells accurately under extreme psychological pressure. The environmental effects that boggarts create in their chosen habitats extend beyond simple magical presence to encompass atmospheric changes that influence local emotional states, creating zones where anxiety levels increase among all individuals who enter, while depression, paranoia, and other negative psychological states become more pronounced, even in people who do not encounter the creatures directly. These environmental influences make boggart infestations problematic for entire communities rather than just individual victims. The research challenges that magical naturalists face when studying boggarts stem from the fundamental incompatibility between objective observation and creatures whose entire existence depends on subjective psychological interaction, making scientific study nearly impossible, since any researcher who comes close enough to observe boggart behavior automatically becomes target for psychological attack that compromises their objectivity while potentially providing the creatures with opportunities to escape or multiply through successful feeding episodes. The legal frameworks that govern boggart encounters reflect societal ambivalence about creatures that pose genuine psychological threats, while not typically causing permanent physical harm, creating regulatory approaches that treat them as nuisances rather than serious dangers. Despite evidence that boggart encounters can trigger lasting psychological trauma that requires professional treatment and may permanently alter victims' ability to function normally in situations that remind them of their transformative encounters. The therapeutic applications that some healers have explored involve controlled boggart exposure, designed to help patients confront and process fears in supportive environments where professional assistance is immediately available. But these experimental treatments remain controversial due to ethical concerns about deliberately subjecting vulnerable individuals to psychological attack, even when such exposure might theoretically provide benefits through forced confrontation with avoided emotional material. The detection methods used to identify boggart presence in potentially infested locations must account for creatures whose magical signatures change constantly based on their current manifestations, while their resting states produce minimal detectable energy, requiring investigation techniques that combine magical sensing with psychological profiling to identify environmental conditions that suggest boggart habitation, even when the creatures themselves remain undetected through conventional surveillance méthode. The seasonal variations in boggart activity appear to correlate with periods when human psychological vulnerability reaches peak levels, including winter months when depression rates increase, anniversary dates of traumatic events when grief responses intensify, and cultural periods associated with death, judgment, or supernatural threats, when collective anxiety makes entire communities more susceptible to boggart predation and less capable of mounting effective resistance to their psychological attacks. The educational programs designed to teach recognition and response to boggart encounters must balance practical preparation with psychological protection, providing students with defensive knowledge while avoiding detailed descriptions of boggart capabilities that might create new fears or anxieties that could make future encounters more dangerous. These programs often focus more on general principles of fear management than specific creature behaviors to minimize psychological contamination while building genuine defensive competence. The international variations in boggart behavior reflect cultural differences in fear patterns and psychological development, with creatures adapting their shape-shifting repertoires to local phobias, cultural taboos, and region-specific trauma patterns, while maintaining their fundamental hunting strategies across different magical communities. These adaptations make boggart encounters particularly challenging for travelers who may encounter fear patterns that their cultural backgrounds did not prepare them to recognize or resist. The magical theory that explains boggart shapeshifting suggests creatures that exist primarily in psychological dimensions while maintaining minimal presence in physical reality, with their transformations representing temporary materialization of psychological constructs rather than true physical change, which would explain their dependence on observer consciousness and their inability to maintain consistent form in the absence of minds capable of providing fear-based energy that sustains their physical manifestations. The long-term psychological effects of boggart encounters can include development of specific phobias related to the forms their attackers assumed, generalized anxiety about shape-shifting creatures or magical threats, and in some cases, post-traumatic stress responses that interfere with normal magical education and social development, while creating vulnerability to future boggart attacks that may be more severe due to psychological sensitization created by previous encounters. The breeding programs that some researchers have attempted to establish for controlled boggart study have consistently failed due to the creature's requirement for genuine fear responses from conscious victims, making it impossible to maintain captive populations in laboratory environments where their feeding needs cannot be met ethically, while their reproductive requirements demand successful psychological predation that research ethics prevent investigators from providing through experimental subjects. The philosophical implications of boggart existence raise questions about the nature of fear, reality, and consciousness that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between internal psychological states and external magical phenomena, suggesting that subjective experiences may possess objective existence under certain magical conditions, while demonstrating that psychological vulnerabilities can become genuine physical threats when exploited by entities, specifically adapted to bridge the gap between mental and material reality. The doppelgangers that represent advanced evolution of shape-shifting predation take boggart capabilities to their logical extreme by abandoning fear-based hunting in favor of identity theft that allows them to infiltrate social networks while eliminating their targets through methods that go beyond simple impersonation to encompass complete replacement of individuals whose lives they appropriate for purposes that may extend far beyond immediate feeding requirements into long-term strategic infiltration of magical onimo communities. The detection of doppelganger presence requires investigation techniques that account for creatures whose impersonation abilities exceed even advanced polyjuice potion effects by incorporating not just physical transformation but behavioral mimicry, memory access, and magical signature replication that can fool even close family members and intimate friends, while maintaining deceptions for extended periods that allow complete integration into their victims' social and professional lives. The prevention methods that individuals can employ to protect themselves from both boggarts and doppelgangers focus primarily on psychological development that reduces vulnerability to fear-based attacks while building self-awareness that makes identity theft more difficult to accomplish successfully. But these protective approaches require ongoing personal work that most people find difficult to maintain consistently, while providing protection that remains incomplete against creatures whose capabilities continue evolving in response to human defensive adaptation. In the spaces between what is real and what is feared, where the boundaries of consciousness become permeable to intrusions that transform internal terror into external threat, these shape-shifting predators continue their patient hunt for minds unprepared to face their own deepest vulnerabilities made manifest. They are reminders that the greatest dangers often come not from external enemies but from aspects of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, that fear unexamined becomes fear exploitable, and that the most effective monsters are those that wear the faces of our own psychological shadows, while pursuing us with intimate knowledge of exactly which wounds will cause the most lasting damage to souls that hoped their private terrors would remain forever hidden in darkness. In the depths of the Department of Mysteries, where ancient magic seeps through stone corridors like whispered secrets that dare not be spoken aloud, there stands an archway whose simple appearance belies the profound terror of what lies beyond its fluttering veil. This gateway between worlds, shrouded in fabric that moves without wind and calls without voice, represents perhaps the most dangerous artifact in the entire Ministry of Magic. Not because of what it does, but because of what it offers to those desperate enough to seek answers that the living were never meant to possess. Tonight, as you rest safely in realms where death remains distant and theoretical, let us approach that terrible threshold where the boundary between existence and oblivion becomes thin enough to cross, and where the voices of the departed whisper promises that may be either salvation or the cruelest deception ever devised by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The veil itself appears deceptively simple to casual observation, nothing more than an ancient stone archway topped with fabric that flutters in breezes that blow from directions that do not exist in normal space. Yet those who possess enhanced magical perception recognize immediately that they are looking upon something that violates fundamental laws governing the relationship between life and death. The cloth moves with purpose rather than responding to air currents, reaching toward observers with gestures that suggest consciousness while producing sounds that bypass the ears entirely to speak directly to that portion of the mind where grief and longing dwell in uncomfortable proximity to hope and desperation. The chamber that houses this artifact has been designed with protections that go far beyond simple security measures to encompass containment systems that prevent the veil's influence from spreading throughout the Department of Mysteries while limiting access to individuals whose psychological profiles suggest they possess sufficient emotional stability to resist the compulsions that the gateway generates in minds already weakened by loss or traumatized by encounters with mortality. These protections include not just magical barriers, but carefully crafted environmental conditions that minimize the veil's ability to project its influence, while providing researchers with controlled conditions for studying phenomena that remain dangerous, even under ideal, observational circumstances. The voices that whisper through the veil's fabric speak in languages that the conscious mind cannot identify, while conveying meanings that bypass rational thought to communicate directly with emotional responses that grief and longing have prepared to receive whatever messages the speakers choose to transmit. Those who have lost loved ones report hearing familiar tones and cadences that suggest specific individuals trying to communicate from beyond death's boundary, while those who have never experienced significant loss describe general murmurings that create overwhelming urge to approach closer in hopes of understanding what wisdom or comfort the voices might provide. Harry Potter's ability to hear these whispers clearly, while others in the same chamber perceived only indistinct murmuring, reflected his unusual relationship with death and the traumatic experiences that had shaped his psychological development in ways that made him more sensitive to communications from realms adjacent to mortality. His reaction to the voices, curiosity mixed with longing rather than fear or revulsion, demonstrated how the veil's influence operated by exploiting existing emotional vulnerabilities while promising resolution or reunion that logical analysis would recognize as impossible but grieving hearts found irresistible. Luna Lovegood's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the voices revealed her characteristic ability to accept magical phenomena without being overwhelmed by their implications, treating communication from beyond death as simply another aspect of magical reality, rather than as violation of natural law that demanded explanation or provoked existential crisis. Her casual attitude toward the veil's whispers suggested psychological integration of death as natural transition, rather than tragic interruption, making her less vulnerable to manipulation by entities whose power depended on exploiting fear and denial regarding mortality. Sirius Black's fate upon falling through the veil demonstrated the irrevocable nature of crossing that threshold, with his physical form disappearing completely while leaving no trace that conventional magical methods could detect or retrieve, suggesting transportation to dimensions where normal rescue techniques would prove ineffective, even if the precise location of his consciousness could be determined. His expression of surprise rather than pain, as he fell backward through the fabric, indicated that crossing the veil might not involve physical suffering but rather transition so rapid and complete that awareness of what was happening came too late for resistance or preparation. The research programs that the Department of Mysteries has conducted regarding the veil's properties must balance scientific curiosity with recognition that some phenomena are too dangerous for normal investigative approaches, requiring observation methods that prevent researchers from being influenced by the artifact's psychological effects, while gathering data about magical processes that operate according to principles that current theoretical frameworks cannot adequately explain or predict. These studies have revealed energy patterns and dimensional fluctuations that suggest the veil serves as active portal rather than passive monument, with periods of increased activity that correlate with celestial alignments and magical field variations. The historical records that document the veil's presence in the Department of Mysteries extend back to the ministry's founding, without providing clear information about its origins or original purpose, suggesting that it was discovered rather than created by human magic, while being incorporated into the department's collection of dangerous artifacts because its properties made it too valuable for study and too dangerous for destruction or abandonment. The fragmentary accounts that survive from early ministry archives describe accidents and disappearances that establish the current security protocols, while demonstrating that the veil's current containment represents hard-won knowledge purchased through casualties, whose exact number remains classified information. The guardians that some researchers have reported observing near the veil appear to be entities whose nature and purpose remain unclear, with descriptions varying from translucent figures that may represent previous victims to completely alien beings whose presence suggests that the veil serves as gateway, not just between life and death, but between entirely different forms of existence that operate according to magical laws that bear no resemblance to those governing normal wizarding experience. These guardian entities demonstrate awareness of living observers while remaining largely unresponsive to attempts at communication or interaction. The psychological effects that extended exposure to the veil creates include gradual erosion of attachment to physical existence, combined with increasing fascination with questions about post-mortem consciousness that can develop into obsessions capable of compromising researchers' judgment and personal safety. Multiple investigators have required transfer from veil-related projects due to behavioral changes that indicated unhealthy preoccupation with crossing the threshold, while several others have disappeared under circumstances that suggest they may have deliberately entered the veil during periods when security protocols were relaxed or compromised. The magical theory that attempts to explain the veil's function suggests dimensional gateway that connects normal reality with realms where consciousness exists independently of physical form, allowing communication between living and dead, while preventing return travel that would violate fundamental principles governing the separation between different states of existence. This theoretical framework would explain both the veil's ability to facilitate one-way communication and the impossibility of retrieving individuals who have crossed the threshold, while raising questions about whether the voices heard by observers represent genuine contact with deceased persons or something more complex and potentially deceptive. The security measures that protect the veil chamber include not just physical barriers and magical wards, but psychological screening procedures designed to identify individuals whose emotional states or personal histories make them vulnerable to the veil's influence, with access restricted to personnel whose profiles suggest they can conduct necessary research while maintaining sufficient emotional distance to avoid being compromised by extended exposure to phenomena that exploit grief, curiosity, and longing for contact with deceased loved ones. The containment protocols that govern veil research acknowledge that the artifact cannot be moved, destroyed, or significantly modified without triggering consequences that current magical knowledge cannot predict or control, making in situ study the only viable approach while requiring acceptance that some aspects of its function may remain forever beyond human understanding. These protocols emphasize observation over experimentation, while strictly prohibiting any attempts to enhance the veil's capabilities or deliberately increase its influence beyond current parameters. The temporal effects that some researchers have reported during veil observations include perception of time dilation or acceleration that suggests proximity to the artifact may influence local space-time relationships in ways that normal chronometric instruments cannot detect or measure accurately. These temporal distortions appear to be most pronounced during periods when the veil displays increased activity, with some investigators reporting experiences that felt like hours of observation, compressed into minutes of measured time, or brief moments that seemed to extend indefinitely. The communication attempts that various research teams have made to establish contact with entities beyond the veil have produced inconsistent results that range from apparent responses to complete silence, with success rates that appear to correlate with observers' personal relationships to death and loss, rather than with specific methodological approaches or magical techniques employed during contact attempts. These inconsistencies suggest that the veil's communication capabilities may be selective rather than universally accessible. The philosophical implications of the veil's existence force uncomfortable questions about the nature of death, consciousness, and the possibility of post-mortem survival that challenge both magical and mundane understanding of mortality, while providing no clear answers that could resolve theological and scientific debates about what happens to individual awareness after physical death occurs. The veil offers tantalizing suggestions of continued existence beyond bodily death, while remaining fundamentally ambiguous about the nature and quality of such existence. The institutional policies that govern public knowledge of the veil reflect recognition that widespread awareness of its existence could create social disruption through individuals seeking to use it for contact with deceased relatives or as means of suicide that appears to offer alternatives to conventional death, making information security essential for preventing both individual tragedies and larger social upheaval that might result from public access to phenomena that most people lack psychological preparation to encounter safely. The investigative techniques that prove most effective for veil research emphasize passive observation over active experimentation, while requiring researchers to maintain detailed psychological profiles that document changes in emotional state, sleep patterns, and social relationships that might indicate developing unhealthy fascination with the artifact's properties or gradually increasing vulnerability to its influence on judgment and decision-making processes. The training programs that prepare researchers for veil-related assignments include extensive psychological conditioning designed to build resistance to the artifact's influence, while providing emergency procedures for situations where investigators show signs of compromised judgment or dangerous behavioral changes that suggest they may be planning to cross the threshold deliberately or have become unable to maintain appropriate professional distance from their research subjects. The documentation requirements for veil research mandate recording not just observational data, but detailed accounts of researchers' subjective experiences during exposure periods, creating archives that reveal patterns in how different personality types respond to the artifact's influence, while building databases that may eventually provide insight into the psychological mechanisms through which the veil affects human consciousness and decision-making processes. The ethical debates that surround continued veil research center on questions about whether pursuit of knowledge about post-mortem existence justifies exposing human researchers to psychological hazards that may cause lasting harm or death, with some arguing that the potential benefits of understanding death's true nature outweigh individual risks, while others contend that no knowledge is worth the casualties that Veil research has already claimed and will continue to demand. The international cooperation that Veil research has fostered includes sharing of observational data and theoretical frameworks with magical communities that possess similar artifacts or phenomena, creating networks of researchers whose combined efforts may eventually provide comprehensive understanding of dimensional gateways and their relationship to consciousness, death, and the possibility of existence beyond physical embodiment, while maintaining security protocols that prevent dangerous information from reaching inappropriate audiences. The psychological support systems that the Department of Mysteries provides for Veil researchers include mandatory counseling sessions designed to monitor mental health while providing therapeutic intervention for individuals showing signs of unhealthy obsession with death or dangerous fascination with crossing the veil themselves, recognizing that exposure to phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about mortality can create psychological instability that requires professional treatment rather than simple reassignment to different research projects. In that silent chamber where stone and fabric frame doorway to mysteries that may be too vast for human comprehension, the veil continues its patient dance between worlds, while voices from beyond whisper promises that may represent either genuine hope for reunion with the departed or cosmic cruelty that exploits grief for purposes that living minds cannot fathom. It stands as a reminder that some thresholds should not be crossed until crossing becomes inevitable, that some questions may be too dangerous to answer while we remain among the living, and that death's greatest mystery may not be what lies beyond it, but why those who have crossed that boundary seem so eager to encourage others to follow them into realms where return becomes impossible and understanding comes too late to benefit those left behind in worlds where mystery remains preferable to truth that destroys everything we thought we knew about the nature of existence itself. As our journey through shadow and scale draws to its close, rest in the knowledge that even the most terrifying creatures serve their purpose in the great tapestry of magic. These beings of nightmare and wonder remind us that power without wisdom leads to destruction, that fear teaches respect, and that even in darkness there exists a terrible beauty worth understanding. The basilisk's deadly gaze protects ancient secrets. The Dementor's kiss reminds us to cherish joy, and the Phoenix's flames show us that death is not an ending but a transformation. Sleep now, knowing that these creatures of terror and majesty continue their eternal dance in realms beyond our waking world. Let their stories guide your dreams, where fear becomes fascination, and nightmares transform into the deepest truths about magic itself. In darkness, we find not just horror, but the profound beauty of forces too vast and ancient for mortal comprehension.